Welcome to Lost in Disclosure, and thanks for watching Lost in Disclosure.
Chapter 1: The Greys, Icons of Abduction. Throughout history, human beings have reported encounters with strange entities from the sky. Some were described as radiant and angelic, others as monstrous and terrifying, and many as simply beyond words. Yet among all these countless descriptions, one type of being has come to dominate the modern imagination more than any other. When people today picture an alien, the image that appears is almost always the same. A small figure, hairless, with oversized black eyes and featureless gray skin. The story of the Greys began to take shape in the early 1960s. Before then, most alleged visitors were described as human-like, tall, radiant, sometimes blonde, often resembling idealized versions of ourselves. But in 1961, an American couple named Betty and Barney Hill reported an encounter that changed everything. Driving through New Hampshire late at night, they claimed to have been intercepted by a strange craft and later subjected to an abduction that terrified them both. Under hypnosis, they described small figures with enormous heads and dark, wraparound eyes. It was the first detailed account of what we now recognize as the Greys. The Hill case was investigated by civilian UFO groups, covered by the press, and eventually examined by the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book. What stood out was not just the claim of abduction, but the unusual description of the beings themselves. Soon after, other people began to tell similar stories, many who had never even heard of the Hills. The archetype had entered our collective imagination. Descriptions of Greys remain remarkably consistent. They are small in stature, often between 3 and 4 feet tall, though some reports describe taller versions that reach 6 feet. Their bodies are thin and hairless, their skin smooth and gray, sometimes pale, sometimes dark. Their heads are oversized compared to their spindly frames, with almost no nose, no ears, and only a slit for a mouth. But their most defining feature, and the one that leaves the deepest impression, are the eyes. Large, almond-shaped, black, and utterly unreadable. Witnesses say these eyes communicate without sound, projecting thoughts and images directly into the human mind. This telepathic presence is what makes them so disturbing. People who claim encounters describe being awake, yet unable to move, paralyzed as these figures surround them. The Greys in these stories are not cruel in the human sense, but they are clinical. They work with a surgeon's detachment, moving efficiently, their motives never explained. By the 1970s and 80s, reports of Grey abductions surged. Writers like Bud Hopkins documented cases of ordinary people who found themselves missing hours of time, only to later recall, under hypnosis, experiences aboard strange craft. Many told of being placed on examination tables, of tissue samples being taken, of procedures that resembled medical experiments. Dr. David Jacobs, who spent decades studying these accounts, suggested the Greys were engaged in a vast program of genetic manipulation, using human DNA to prolong their own species. For those who lived through these experiences, the trauma was real. Some suffered nightmares, phobias, and the persistent sense of being watched. Yet others described moments of strange connection, as if the Greys were not merely experimenting, but also delivering a message that humanity was at a crossroads and its future mattered beyond Earth. The question of where the Greys come from remains unsettled. A popular theory links them to the star system Zeta Reticuli, about 39 light-years away. This idea took root when Betty Hill described seeing a star map aboard the craft later matched by amateur astronomer Marjorie Fish to that system. Others believe the Greys may not be extraterrestrial at all, but time travelers, future humans returning to study their ancestors. Still others suggest they are interdimensional beings, crossing from parallel realities into ours. What makes the Greys difficult to dismiss is their consistency across cultures and decades. Thousands of people across the world describe nearly identical beings, despite vast differences in background, belief, or exposure to UFO lore. For skeptics, this is proof of cultural contamination, stories repeating because people have seen the same image in films or on television. But for believers, the opposite is true. The culture only reflects what witnesses were already experiencing. Whatever the explanation, the Greys have become inseparable from UFO culture. They are the face of aliens in films, comics, and television shows. They are stamped onto toys and emojis, their image instantly recognizable worldwide. Yet that image began with frightened witnesses describing encounters that they swore were real. The Greys stand as the central archetype of alien contact. They are the surgeons of the abduction room, the silent watchers in the night, the beings who embody both our deepest fears and our sense that something greater is watching. And they are only the beginning, because while the Greys symbolize cold detachment, other encounters tell of beings who are radiant, almost angelic, figures who bring messages of peace instead of fear. These are the Nordics, and they represent a very different vision of the unknown. Chapter 2. The Nordics, Visitors of Light. When most people think of aliens today, the first image that comes to mind is the Grey. Small, frail, and cold, they have become the face of abduction stories around the world. But before the Greys dominated modern accounts, another type of being was already making its presence known. These visitors were not short or menacing. Instead, they were described as tall, radiant, and almost angelic. They became known as the Nordics, or sometimes the Space Brothers, and for a time, they offered a vision of contact that was hopeful, even uplifting. The story of the Nordics first gained traction in the 1950s, during what came to be known as the contactee era. It was a time when UFOs filled headlines almost daily, and a number of individuals stepped forward claiming not only to have seen the craft, but to have met their occupants face to face. Unlike the fear and trauma that would later characterize abduction accounts, these early encounters were often filled with messages about peace, unity, and the dangers of nuclear war. One of the most famous contactees was George Adamski, who in 1952 claimed he had met a being from Venus in the California desert. He described the visitor as tall, with long blonde hair, striking blue eyes, and an aura of warmth. According to Adamski, this figure communicated telepathically, warning of the destructive path humanity was on and urging an end to atomic testing. His story was ridiculed by skeptics, but inspired countless others to share similar encounters. The label Nordic came later, drawn from their resemblance to Northern European features. They were said to stand between 6 and 7 feet tall, with fair skin, golden or platinum blonde hair, and eyes that were often described as unusually vivid, blue, violet, or piercingly bright. Witnesses spoke of an almost angelic quality, as if the beings radiated calm simply by their presence. Unlike the blank faces of the Greys, the Nordics were expressive, showing emotion and intent through their gaze and posture. In the early years, the Nordics were often portrayed as messengers of peace. Many of their supposed encounters revolved around warnings about humanity's destructive capabilities. During the height of the Cold War, when the threat of nuclear annihilation was on everyone's mind. These beings were said to caution against atomic testing, urging humans to live in harmony with one another and with the planet. To those who experienced such encounters, the Nordics were not invaders, but guardians, concerned with guiding a young civilization toward a more enlightened future. These stories were not limited to the United States. In Europe, contactees in Italy and Sweden reported encounters with tall, radiant figures who stepped out of silent craft and attempted to communicate. In South America, witnesses in Brazil and Peru described similar beings, warning about environmental destruction and offering advice on how to preserve the planet. Despite the geographical distances, the accounts shared the same imagery. Tall, human-like beings with blonde hair, radiant eyes, and a calm but commanding presence. As abduction narratives began to overtake contactee stories in the 1970s and 80s, Nordics continued to appear, though often in a different role. In these accounts, they were no longer the messengers of peace standing alone. Instead, they appeared alongside the Greys, sometimes acting as overseers or interpreters during abductions. Some witnesses described them as providing comfort during frightening medical procedures, while others said the Nordics observed silently, their intentions unclear. This shift from saviors to supervisors added a new layer of complexity to their image. Where do the Nordics come from? Theories vary. Many contactees insisted they hailed from the Pleiades star cluster, more than 400 light-years away. Others linked them to Venus or Mars, though modern science has made such origins unlikely. Some researchers suggest they might be advanced versions of humanity itself, time travelers from the future. Others see them as symbolic, projections of our collective desire for benevolent guidance during turbulent times. What makes the Nordic archetype so compelling is how sharply it contrasts with the Greys. Where Greys are seen as cold and clinical, Nordics are warm and human-like. Where Greys evoke fear of dehumanization, Nordics embody the hope of spiritual evolution. And yet, their motives remain as mysterious as any other. If they truly exist, are they here to guide humanity, or do they play a role in the same larger program attributed to the Greys? Culturally, the Nordics have become the archetype of the good alien. They appear in books, films, and television series as enlightened visitors, more advanced versions of ourselves. Their resemblance to angelic figures has led some to suggest they may be behind many religious encounters throughout history. That the angels of Scripture and the luminous beings of myth were, in fact, the same figures now described as Nordics. The Nordics remain one of the most fascinating and enduring alien archetypes. They stand as a counterpoint to the fear and trauma of the abduction era, offering instead the possibility of guidance and kinship. Yet even within their seemingly benevolent presence lies uncertainty. Are they protectors, watchers, or collaborators in a larger plan beyond our understanding? As we move forward, the story of alien contact turns once again into darker territory. For just as some visitors appear radiant and human-like, others are described as monstrous and predatory. In the next chapter, we turn to the Reptilians, beings said to embody fear, secrecy, and domination, and whose presence has become central to some of the most unsettling theories in UFO lore. Chapter 3: The Reptilians, Masters of Control. Not all alleged visitors are described as gentle or enlightened. While the Greys inspire fear through their detachment and the Nordics through their enigmatic beauty, there is another archetype that embodies something far darker. These beings are said to be tall, muscular, scaled, and reptilian in form. They are often linked to control, secrecy, and manipulation, both of individuals and of entire societies. In the mythology of alien encounters, they are the reptilians. Reports of reptilian entities go back long before the UFO era. Ancient civilizations spoke of serpent gods, dragon-like beings, and lizard-headed rulers. In Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki were sometimes depicted with reptilian features. In Mesoamerican lore, the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl combined human and serpent aspects. In Africa, the Zulu tell of the Chitauri, reptilian beings who came from the skies and interfered with early humanity. These myths lay dormant for centuries, but in the 20th century, they resurfaced in a new context, not as gods, but as extraterrestrials. Witness descriptions of reptilians vary, but certain traits are consistent. They are said to stand between 6 and 8 feet tall, with scaled skin that ranges from green to brown. Their eyes are often yellow or red, with slit-like pupils resembling those of snakes. Their bodies are muscular and humanoid, but their faces carry a distinctly reptilian cast, elongated snouts, ridged brows, and sharp teeth. Some accounts describe tails or crests, while others portray them as more subtly lizard-like. Unlike the Greys, who appear clinical, or the Nordics, who seem benevolent, the reptilians are almost always described in terms of hostility or domination. Many abductees who claim to have seen them describe feelings of intense fear, even before the being spoke or moved. Some suggest they possess a form of psychic control, able to instill terror or manipulate perception. Others claim the reptilians use Greys as subordinates, directing abductions and experiments from behind the scenes. In modern UFO lore, the reptilians became especially prominent in the 1990s, popularized by conspiracy theorists who suggested that these beings were not only visiting Earth, but had infiltrated human institutions. Writers like David Icke advanced the idea that world leaders, monarchs, and elites were either controlled by or secretly reptilian themselves. According to this view, the reptilians feed on human fear and suffering, maintaining control through war, manipulation, and secrecy. While many dismiss such theories as fantasy, the reptilian archetype remains deeply ingrained in the darker corners of UFO culture. Not all accounts are purely conspiratorial. Some abductees report direct encounters with reptilian beings during abductions. They describe being taken aboard ships or into underground facilities, where tall reptilian figures supervised medical procedures or issued commands to the smaller Greys. These beings were often described as cold, authoritarian, and utterly uninterested in human well-being. In some stories, however, the reptilians appeared not as overlords, but as warriors, entities driven by survival and dominance rather than secrecy. The question of their origin remains as speculative as with other alien types. Some link them to Alpha Draconis, the star system in the constellation Draco. Others place them closer, suggesting they may inhabit subterranean realms beneath the Earth, hidden for millennia. The idea of reptilian races within the Earth has roots in both folklore and esoteric writings, where tunnels and underground cities are often associated with serpent-like beings. Skeptics point out that the reptilian archetype fits deep-seated human fears. Throughout evolution, humans have had to contend with predators like snakes and crocodiles. The image of a reptilian predator, standing upright and intelligent, taps into something primal within the human psyche. It may be that these visions arise from cultural symbolism and unconscious archetypes rather than literal beings. Yet for those who claim direct encounters, the fear they describe is anything but symbolic. The reptilians also serve a symbolic role in modern mythology. They embody the idea of hidden control, the suspicion that humanity's destiny is not entirely its own. Whether through conspiracy theories of governments controlled by alien forces or ancient legends of serpent gods manipulating mankind, they represent the darkest possibility that humanity is being farmed, fed upon, or dominated by a force it barely perceives. Culturally, the reptilian archetype has found its way into films, television, and literature. From science fiction villains with lizard-like features to the shape-shifting antagonists in shows like V or Doctor Who, the idea of reptilian beings hiding among us resonates with audiences. Even outside of UFO circles, the notion of hidden lizard overlords has become a meme, shorthand for paranoia about power and corruption. Yet beneath the exaggeration lies a core of reports from people who insist they have seen these beings with their own eyes. Whether encountered in abduction scenarios, glimpsed in shadowed bedrooms, or perceived in altered states of consciousness, the testimonies remain. Some describe them as rulers of a hierarchy, with greys as their workers. Others see them as predators, existing only to feed. The details shift, but the essence remains constant. Tall, reptilian beings who instill fear and assert control. The reptilians stand as one of the most unsettling figures in alien lore. They represent not just the possibility of other beings visiting Earth, but the idea that those beings may already hold power here, shaping events in ways we cannot see. For believers, they are a hidden enemy. For skeptics, they are the embodiment of ancient archetypes. For storytellers, they are a perfect villain, powerful, terrifying, and always watching. As we continue this journey, the imagery shifts again. From the cold efficiency of the Greys, the radiance of the Nordics, and the menace of the Reptilians, we turn next to a very different archetype. These beings are insect-like, towering and alien in form, evoking both fascination and dread. In the next chapter, we explore the Insectoids, often described as the overseers of abductions and the minds behind the hive. Chapter 4. The Insectoids, the hive mind. Among the many types of beings described in abduction accounts, few are as unnerving as the Insectoids. Where Greys seem clinical and Nordics radiant, the Insectoids are truly alien. Witnesses often describe them as tall, thin, mantis-like creatures with elongated limbs and large, compound eyes. They are usually portrayed not as background figures, but as leaders, the ones directing operations, supervising medical procedures, and guiding the smaller Greys. The earliest descriptions of insect-like aliens emerged alongside abduction reports in the 1960s and 70s, though they never reached the same level of notoriety as the Greys. In case after case, abductees spoke of figures that resembled praying mantises, towering over both the Greys and the humans. Unlike the Greys, who carried out tasks with clinical efficiency, the Insectoids were said to observe, communicate telepathically, and radiate authority. Abductees often report the Insectoids as being between 7 and 9 feet tall, with spindly frames that appear fragile yet imposing. Their heads are triangular, with large, slanted eyes that give the impression of depth and intelligence. Their skin is often described as green, brown, or gray, with a texture that suggests a hardened exoskeleton. They rarely speak aloud. Instead, witnesses say they project thoughts directly into the mind in a way that feels commanding but not always hostile. One of the most striking aspects of these accounts is the sense of hierarchy they convey. Many abductees report greys performing medical examinations or gathering samples, but with a mantis-like being watching silently in the background, overseeing everything. Some describe these insectoids stepping forward only when necessary, to calm a frightened abductee or to ensure a procedure is carried out correctly. Others say the insectoids are the true architects of the hybrid program, directing genetic experiments that blend human and alien DNA. In some accounts, abductees describe feeling an unexpected sense of calm in the presence of these beings. Despite their terrifying appearance, the insectoids are often portrayed as wise and purposeful, as though they are scientists or philosophers with a broader vision than the greys. But just as often, witnesses report feelings of dread, the sense that they are facing a superior intelligence that regards humans as little more than resources. Theories about the insectoids' role vary. Some researchers believe they represent the upper tier of an alien hierarchy, with greys serving as their workers or drones. In this model, the greys are not independent beings at all, but bioengineered tools, while the insectoids act as the minds behind the hive. Others argue that the insect-like appearance may be symbolic, a projection of human fears about conformity, control, and the loss of individuality. After all, insects on Earth live in highly structured societies where the individual is expendable, and the colony is all that matters. This symbolism resonates deeply with human anxieties. The idea of a hive mind, of losing autonomy and becoming part of a collective intelligence, is one of our greatest fears. Science fiction has explored this theme repeatedly, from alien queens commanding drones to the assimilation of entire civilizations. The insectoid archetype seems to embody this fear, presenting beings who are intelligent, purposeful, and utterly indifferent to individual human desires. Some abductees, however, describe moments of profound connection with insectoids. They report visions of ecological collapse, warnings about humanity's destructive habits, and pleas to care for the Earth. In these encounters, the insectoids seem less like overseers and more like guardians, trying to steer humanity toward survival. Whether these messages are genuine or part of a larger manipulation remains unclear, but they add nuance to an otherwise frightening archetype. Skeptics argue that the insectoids are nothing more than projections of the human subconscious. The praying mantis, with its alien appearance and predatory habits, is a natural candidate for the mind to seize upon when constructing a nightmare. Under hypnosis or in altered states of consciousness, the brain might blend familiar insect shapes with the idea of a superior intelligence, producing the archetype of the mantis-like alien. Yet for those who claim to have seen them, the experience is no dream. Abductees consistently describe their encounters as more real than ordinary memory, vivid and unforgettable. The consistency of the descriptions, the triangular heads, the towering stature, the sense of authority, suggests something deeper than imagination alone. In culture, the insectoid archetype has appeared in films and television, though often more subtly than the greys or reptilians. The idea of insect-like overseers directing alien operations recurs in science fiction, reinforcing the link between extraterrestrials and hive-like societies. These depictions may, in turn, influence how abductees interpret their experiences, creating a cycle between culture and testimony. The insectoids represent one of the most alien of all reported beings. They are not familiar in the way Nordics are, nor clinical like the greys, nor overtly hostile like the reptilians. Instead, they embody the concept of the other in its purest form, beings that are intelligent, powerful, and utterly different from us. For some, they are wise teachers. For others, they are terrifying overseers. For all, they leave behind the impression of encountering something far beyond human understanding. As the journey continues, the narrative shifts again. From mantis-like overseers to fragile but powerful figures, the next type of alien reflects a different kind of mystery. These are the tall whites, said to have worked directly with the military in secret arrangements that blurred the line between science fiction and covert history. Chapter 5. The Tall Whites, Military Encounters. Among all the different alien archetypes, few are as unusual as the tall whites. Unlike the Greys, who show up in abduction accounts, or the Nordics, who arrive with spiritual warnings, the tall whites emerge from claims tied directly to the military. Their story comes largely from one man, Charles James Hall, a former U.S. Air Force weather observer, who said he encountered them repeatedly in the Nevada desert during the 1960s. His testimony, though controversial, painted a picture of fragile-looking but highly advanced beings who coexisted with humans in secrecy. Hall described working on the Nellis Air Force Base ranges in an area known as Range 4. There, he said, he witnessed tall, pale figures moving around the desert at night, sometimes accompanied by human escorts. Over time, he claimed he gained their trust, speaking with them, observing their families, and even interacting with their children. He later published these accounts in his Millennial Hospitality series, arguing that the U.S. military had struck an arrangement with the tall whites, allowing them to use Earth as a way station while traveling through space. According to Hall, the tall whites stood between 6 and 7 feet tall, with extremely pale skin, fine white hair, and delicate features. Some of the elders, he said, grew to more than 8 feet. Their appearance was both human-like and eerie, with narrow faces, high cheekbones, and large, light-colored eyes. They wore tight-fitting suits that seemed to regulate their environment and carried pencil-shaped devices capable of stunning or killing instantly. Despite their frail appearance, they had technology that made them formidable. The tall whites were not described as hostile, but they were deeply protective of their young. Hall claimed that while their children were curious about humans, the adults could become aggressive if they sensed a threat. Their behavior suggested a society highly focused on family bonds and hierarchy. He also insisted they had advanced spacecraft hidden in underground hangars, capable of speeds and maneuvers far beyond anything the U.S. possessed. Unlike many other alien archetypes, the tall whites are unique for being tied so strongly to a military context. Hall described them living side by side with U.S. personnel, though most airmen were kept unaware of their presence. Only a select few, cleared to work near their facilities, ever came close. This secrecy, combined with the idea of cooperation, has made the tall whites a staple of disclosure debates. If true, it would mean not only that extraterrestrials are real, but that governments have interacted with them directly for decades. Skeptics argue that Hall's accounts lack corroboration. No other airmen have come forward to confirm his story, and no physical evidence has ever surfaced. Critics see his books as elaborate fiction rather than testimony. Yet the detail of his descriptions of their society, their personalities, and their interactions with humans has kept interest alive. Even some within UFO circles who doubt parts of his story admit the possibility that elements could be based on truth. The tall whites also occupy an interesting middle ground in the alien pantheon. They are not overtly predatory like the Reptilians, nor detached like the Greys. They do not come with messages of peace like the Nordics, nor with the trickster qualities of ultra-terrestrials. Instead, they appear pragmatic, travelers stopping by, negotiating for resources, and trading technology while keeping themselves apart. In UFO culture, the tall whites symbolize secrecy and cooperation. They embody the fear that governments know more than they admit, and that behind the fences of restricted bases, extraordinary relationships have already been established. Their pale, elongated figures are less familiar than Greys or Nordics, but for those who have heard of them, they represent a chilling possibility that the most extraordinary alien encounters are not happening in hidden abductions, but in plain sight on military land. Hall's accounts remain the foundation of the tall white narrative, and whether believed or not, they offer a glimpse into one of the strangest alleged chapters of contact. Fragile, yet powerful, distant, yet cooperative, they are among the most enigmatic figures in alien lore. Next, the narrative shifts to a very different archetype, one that began not in secret bases, but in the headlines of the 1950s. A frightened Kentucky family claimed their farmhouse was besieged by small creatures with glowing eyes. The press exaggerated. The phrase, "little green men," was born, and the most enduring stereotype of aliens took root. Chapter 6: The Little Green Men, Myth and Mockery. When people joke about aliens, they rarely mention Greys, Nordics, or Reptilians. Instead, they laugh about little green men. The phrase is so deeply rooted in popular culture that it's easy to forget it came from a real event. For decades, little green men has been used as a punchline, a way to dismiss UFO encounters as silly or childish. But behind the cartoon stereotype lies a case that terrified an entire family and helped shape the way the media framed alien stories for generations. The story begins in August of 1955 on a farmhouse near Hopkinsville, Kentucky. That evening, the Sutton family and their friends experienced something that none of them would ever forget. One family member reported seeing a bright object streaking through the sky. Shortly after, strange figures emerged from the woods surrounding their home. The witnesses described them as small, about 3 to 4 feet tall, with oversized heads, glowing yellow eyes, long, spindly arms, and movements that seemed unnatural, almost as if they were floating rather than walking. For hours, according to their testimony, these beings approached the farmhouse repeatedly, peering into windows and brushing against the walls. The family, terrified, opened fire with rifles, but the creatures seemed unaffected, retreating into the darkness only to return again. By the time police arrived, the beings were gone. What officers did find were bullet holes, scattered shells, and a family in a state of genuine fear. There was no evidence of alcohol, no sign of a hoax. To the Suttons, what had happened was real. But when newspapers picked up the story, the headlines told a different tale. They coined the phrase, "little green men," even though the family never once described the creatures as green. In truth, the witnesses said the beings had a metallic sheen, almost silver in color. But little green men made for a better headline, and the legend was born. From that point on, the phrase became inseparable from UFO lore. Whenever someone mentioned aliens, skeptics and comedians alike would mock them with references to little green men. What had been a night of terror for one family became, through the power of the press, a cultural punchline. Yet the details of the Hopkinsville encounter remain striking. The glowing eyes, the strange floating movement, the creatures apparent resistance to bullets. These details match patterns in other close encounter cases reported in the decades that followed. In South America during the 1970s, witnesses described small, glowing-eyed beings emerging from landed craft. In Brazil, farmers reported humanoid figures with strange proportions who seemed impervious to weapons. Even earlier, in 1951, pilots in Korea claimed to see small men inside a glowing object. These reports suggest that the Suttons were not alone in what they saw. The power of the little green men phrase also reshaped memory. Once the image entered popular culture, it became the default shorthand for aliens. Toy companies sold green alien figurines. Cartoons depicted wide-eyed grinning invaders. Even NASA scientists joked about Martians as little green men. Over time, the stereotype became so widespread that real witness reports were overshadowed. Anyone who spoke of seeing a UFO risked ridicule, accused of believing in comic book aliens. Psychologists have suggested that cultural imagery can reinforce memory. When someone under stress recalls a strange encounter, their mind may draw on familiar archetypes. In this way, the phrase "little green men" didn't just mock witnesses. It influenced how future generations would describe their experiences. But for the Sutton family, there was no humor in what happened. They stood by their testimony for the rest of their lives, insisting that something extraordinary had taken place that night. Researchers who revisited the case found the family consistent, reluctant to seek attention, and steadfast in their account. Skeptics have suggested that owls may have been responsible, their reflective eyes and unusual movements mistaken for something otherworldly. Yet the family's description, beings floating, impervious to bullets, with long arms and glowing eyes, goes far beyond what owls could explain. The Hopkinsville incident remains one of the most bizarre cases in UFO history, and one of the best documented. It serves as a reminder of how quickly the media can transform terror into ridicule, and how a single phrase can shape an entire cultural narrative. The stereotype of little green men lives on today, not as evidence of a real species, but as a symbol of mockery. And yet, beneath that symbol lies a genuine mystery. The creatures seen in Kentucky in 1955 were never explained, and their description echoes across reports from around the world. The little green men may have begun as a media invention, but the beings themselves remain one of the strangest puzzles in UFO lore. From here, the journey takes us into even more unsettling territory. Some abductees claim encounters with beings that are neither fully alien nor fully human. Entities described as hybrids, the result of genetic programs that blend species and blur identity. Chapter 7. The Hybrids, Crossing the Divide. Among all the alien archetypes, none cut closer to the human experience than the hybrids. While the Greys are cold and clinical, the Nordics radiant, and the Reptilians predatory, the hybrids sit somewhere in between, beings that appear partly human and partly alien. For many abductees, encounters with hybrids are the most emotional and disturbing of all, touching on reproduction, identity, and the possibility that humanity itself is being reshaped. The idea of hybrids emerged strongly in the 1980s, when abduction researchers began noticing repeated patterns in testimonies. Women reported eggs being taken, men described sperm extractions, and many told of mysterious pregnancies that suddenly disappeared. Bud Hopkins, one of the leading abduction researchers of that era, documented the case of Kathy Davis in his book Intruders. She described having fetuses removed during abductions, only to later be shown children who looked partly human and partly alien. These encounters carried not only physical trauma, but profound psychological weight. The physical descriptions of hybrids vary. Some appear almost entirely human, with only subtle differences, unusually large eyes, thin bodies, or oddly pale skin. Others look far more alien, with oversized heads, grayish complexions, and a fragile presence. Many abductees describe the hybrids as emotionally distant, staring intently but struggling to express feeling. Children shown to abductees are often described as weak, needing care, or curious but detached, as though trying to learn how to be human. Perhaps the most unsettling element is when abductees are told that these children are theirs. Women recall being forced to cradle hybrid infants while being told, "This is your child." Men describe being shown children who looked vaguely like them, but with unmistakably alien features. These moments strike deeply at human instincts for protection and connection. Some abductees describe overwhelming grief at being separated from these children, while others feel violated, as though their parental instincts were being manipulated for control. The purpose behind the hybrid program remains debated. One theory suggests the Greys are a dying race, sterile after centuries of cloning, and are blending their genetics with humans to save themselves. Another view is that hybrids are being prepared to live among us, gradually integrating into human society. Researcher David Jacobs even proposed that some hybrids, whom he called hybrids, could already be living on Earth undetected, their differences subtle enough to pass as human. Others, like Harvard psychiatrist John Mack, took a more symbolic perspective, that hybrids represented an evolutionary step, blending humanity with something greater, perhaps to help us adapt to coming changes. Accounts of hybrids are not limited to the United States. In the United Kingdom, abductee Hilary Porter described repeated encounters and being shown hybrid children. In Brazil, women have reported mysterious pregnancies and visions of hybrid offspring. The consistency across cultures is striking. Procedures focused on reproduction, encounters with children who are neither fully human nor fully alien, and the sense that these beings are vital to some larger plan. Skeptics argue that these stories could be explained by psychological factors, sleep paralysis, false memories, or suggestion under hypnosis. They note that many hybrid accounts emerged after Hopkins and Jacobs began publicizing their research, which may have influenced subsequent reports. Yet others counter that the sheer emotional depth of the testimonies and the physical details sometimes described go far beyond what one would expect from simple imagination. In culture, the hybrid archetype has appeared repeatedly in film and television, often as a symbol of anxiety about identity. From science fiction dramas that explore crossbreeding to horror stories of infiltration, the image of a hybrid child has become shorthand for the loss of purity and the blurring of boundaries. They represent both hope and fear, hope for evolution, fear of replacement. For abductees, though, the hybrids are not symbols. They are remembered as real, as vivid as any waking memory, and their presence leaves a lasting mark. For some, the encounters are devastating, filled with grief for children they can never raise. For others, the experiences are haunting, but carry a strange sense of destiny, as if they were chosen to participate in something larger than themselves. The hybrids stand at the crossroads of alien lore. They are not entirely alien, not entirely human, but something in between. Whether they are part of a literal program or a symbolic expression of deep-seated fears, they embody the possibility that humanity is being changed, not through war or conquest, but through biology itself. From here, the narrative takes an even stranger turn. For while hybrids still belong to the framework of space visitors, there are others who may not come from the stars at all. The next archetype points to entities that seem to slip in and out of our reality, appearing as gods, angels, or monsters depending on the age. These are the ultra-terrestrials, and they challenge everything we think we know about the nature of alien contact. Chapter 8. The Ultra-Terrestrials. Beyond Space. Most accounts of aliens place them among the stars. The Greys are said to come from Zeta Reticuli, the Nordics from the Pleiades, the Reptilians from Draco. But not all researchers believe these visitors are travelers from distant planets. Some argue the truth is stranger, that these beings are not extraterrestrials at all, but something closer, slipping in and out of our world from dimensions we barely understand. They are often called ultra-terrestrials, and their presence challenges the very idea of what it means to be alien. The term gained prominence through the work of John Keel, an investigator who explored cases of high strangeness in the 1960s. Keel is best remembered for his research into the Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. During that wave of activity, witnesses reported not only a winged creature with glowing red eyes, but also strange lights in the sky, visits from men in black, and psychic disturbances. To Keel, these events were all connected. He concluded that the phenomena were not evidence of visitors from outer space, but of intelligences that had always been here, able to shift form, influence perception, and move between realities. Reports of ultra-terrestrials rarely describe one fixed appearance. Instead, they seem fluid. Some witnesses speak of glowing orbs, others of shadowy humanoids. Some describe radiant figures of light, while others tell of grotesque shapes that shift before the eyes. The same intelligence might appear as a UFO, an angel, or a monster, depending on who is watching and what they expect to see. This theory helps explain why similar stories appear throughout history. Medieval peasants reported angels or demons appearing in times of crisis. Folklore across Europe is filled with tales of fairies abducting humans, leaving them dazed with missing time. Accounts almost indistinguishable from modern UFO abductions. Indigenous traditions around the world tell of star people, sky beings, or trickster spirits who interact with humanity in ways both helpful and harmful. If all of these are masks worn by the same underlying intelligence, then what we call aliens today may simply be the latest interpretation of something much older. Modern physics has even offered a way to imagine how this might work. If other dimensions exist beyond the three we know, it is possible that beings could pass between them, appearing and disappearing at will. To us, their movements would seem impossible, defying gravity, blinking in and out of sight, or altering time itself. Many UFO encounters contain exactly these elements: craft that vanish instantly, beings that communicate telepathically, or objects that seem both solid and immaterial. Cases often cited as examples of ultra-terrestrial activity include the Mothman wave of the 1960s, the bizarre phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch in Utah, and the Hessdalen lights of Norway. In each of these places, witnesses report overlapping strangeness: UFOs, cryptid sightings, psychic disturbances, and unexplained energy. Rather than being separate mysteries, they may be facets of the same phenomenon. The question of intent remains a troubling one. Are ultra-terrestrials trying to guide humanity, or are they deceiving us? Keel himself leaned toward the darker view, calling them tricksters who deliberately mislead. They might appear as angels to the faithful, as aliens to modern minds, as monsters to frighten children, all masks to manipulate perception. Other researchers, however, suggest a more benevolent motive, that these entities are trying to nudge human consciousness toward broader understanding, using whatever imagery fits the time. What makes ultra-terrestrials difficult to study is their lack of consistency. Physical evidence is rare, and when it does appear, it often evaporates under scrutiny. Radar contacts vanish, photographs blur, objects dissolve into light. Unlike the Greys, who leave behind implants and scars, ultra-terrestrials leave behind riddles, patterns of synchronicity, fleeting impressions, and strange coincidences that resist scientific measurement. Still, their cultural influence is significant. From books and documentaries to shows exploring paranormal hotspots, the idea that aliens may be interdimensional has gained traction. Even recent discussions of UFOs by governments and scientists now acknowledge the possibility that unidentified aerial phenomena may represent non-human intelligences not bound by our physics. The ultra-terrestrials stand as the most elusive figures in alien lore. They defy categorization, appearing in forms that shift with culture and expectation. They may be the same beings humanity has always encountered, wearing different masks for different ages. Angels, demons, fairies, aliens, all may be the same intelligence glimpsed through different lenses. As our journey nears its end, it is worth stepping back to consider the bigger picture. From Greys to Nordics, from reptilians to hybrids, from insect-like overseers to ultra-terrestrial tricksters, the diversity of reported beings is staggering. In the final chapter, we will bring these threads together and ask what they mean. Are these truly separate species visiting Earth, or different faces of the same unknown intelligence? The pantheon of the unknown reveals as much about humanity as it does about the cosmos. Chapter 9: The Pantheon of the Unknown. Across decades of reports, investigations, and stories, a gallery of beings has emerged. Each type reflects not only the mystery of the unknown, but also the anxieties, hopes, and questions of humanity itself. From the Greys with their cold detachment, to the radiant Nordics who promise peace, to the Reptilians who embody control and domination, these archetypes tell us as much about ourselves as they do about the possibility of others. The Insectoids loom like overseers, their alien mantis forms watching silently from the shadows, directing abductions as though managing a hive. The tall whites, pale and fragile, step out of secrecy tied to military bases and whispered cooperation. The little green men began in terror on a Kentucky farm, only to become the punchline of an entire culture. The hybrids embody the deepest fears of intrusion, blurring the line between human and alien. And beyond them all, the ultra-terrestrials dissolve the borders of space entirely, hinting that these intelligences may not come from stars at all, but from dimensions that weave through our reality. Taken together, they form a pantheon of the unknown. Some inspire dread, others awe. Some bring warnings, others take without asking. Whether they are separate species, cultural masks, or manifestations of one deeper phenomenon, they are persistent. They recur across decades, continents, and belief systems. Farmers, soldiers, children, and pilots alike describe them, often in detail that is strikingly consistent. What does this tell us? One possibility is that we are truly being visited by many different races, each with its own agenda. Another is that these archetypes are different faces of the same intelligence, adapting its form to suit our expectations. Or perhaps they are mirrors, projections of our own subconscious fears and desires, given shape in moments of altered perception. Each explanation carries profound implications, but none fully satisfies. What is undeniable is that these stories endure. The Greys, Nordics, Reptilians, Insectoids, tall whites, little green men, hybrids, and ultra-terrestrials have all entered our culture. They fill books, films, and conversations. They are drawn on t-shirts and debated in documentaries. They appear in the nightmares of abductees and in the headlines of tabloids. Whether real or imagined, they have become part of humanity's mythology, the modern pantheon of our encounter with the unknown. And as the skies continue to produce mysteries, as governments declassify fragments of their archives, and as witnesses come forward with stories that challenge belief, the question lingers: who or what are we sharing reality with? Until the answers arrive, the Council of Archetypes remains, watching, waiting, shaping our fears and our imagination. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the pantheon of alien beings. This has been Dreams of Disclosure. If you found this exploration intriguing, we invite you to check out our other videos: more encounters, more mysteries, and more stories from the edge of the unknown. Until next time, keep watching the skies and keep questioning what lies beyond. If you're still with us, drifting in that quiet space between thought and sleep, we'll now share a few lesser-known encounters. Whispers from the edges of memory. Stories buried deep, just in case your eyes haven't closed yet. Let's continue. Levelland UFO Case, 1957 Texas. On the night of November 2nd, 1957, the flat roads around Levelland, Texas, were quiet and cold. The prairie stretched into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of headlights on empty highways and the hum of engines. It was a night like countless others in West Texas. Until cars began to stall, lights flickered out, and frightened drivers looked up to see a glowing object hovering above the asphalt. The first report came from Pedro Saucedo, a farm worker driving with a friend along Highway 116, just outside Levelland. Around 11 p.m., Saucedo saw a flash of light streaking across the sky before a massive, glowing object descended toward the road ahead. He later described it as a torpedo-shaped craft, about 200 feet long, glowing bright blue. As it approached, the engine of his truck sputtered and died, and his headlights cut out. The two men jumped out of the vehicle in fear. They claimed the object roared overhead with a rush of wind and heat, then disappeared into the night. As soon as it was gone, the truck started again. Less than an hour later, at nearly the same spot, another motorist had an almost identical experience. His car died abruptly as a glowing object descended, hovering close enough to light up the road. When the object vanished, the car restarted. Over the next 2 hours, the Levelland police station received at least 15 separate calls from drivers across the area describing the same phenomenon: engines stalling, lights failing, and a glowing object hovering above the highway. Some described it as egg-shaped, others as cigar-shaped, but all agreed on its brilliance. The craft seemed to emit its own light, a pulsating glow that bathed the landscape in unnatural color. Sheriff Weir Clem, skeptical at first, decided to investigate personally. Driving into the area of repeated reports, he too saw a flash of light cross the sky and felt his engine falter. Though his car didn't completely stall, the experience shook him. By then, The pattern was undeniable. Ordinary people, farmers, truck drivers, young couples, and the county sheriff himself were all describing the same thing within the same window of time. The physical effect on vehicles gave the case unusual weight. Unlike most UFO sightings, which rely solely on visual testimony, the Levelland events included mechanical interference experienced again and again. Cars stalled only when the object was present and started again as soon as it was gone. For investigators, this detail became the cornerstone of the case. Within 48 hours, the U.S. Air Force sent officials from Project Blue Book to Levelland. Investigators interviewed witnesses and examined reports. Their conclusion was swift and, to many, unsatisfying. The sightings were caused by an electrical storm and ball lightning. But there had been no storms in the area that night, and ball lightning rarely lasts more than a few seconds, let alone long enough to stall multiple cars across miles of roadway. Witnesses also insisted the object was structured and solid, not a flicker of atmospheric discharge. The Air Force explanation did little to quiet the controversy. Newspapers across the country carried headlines about the Levelland flying saucer, and the incident became one of the most famous UFO cases of the 1950s. In Washington, the event was cited as one of the strongest examples of unexplained aerial activity, notable because of its physical impact on machines. For the residents of Levelland, the memory endured in vivid detail. One witness recalled how the glow of the craft turned the highway as bright as midday, throwing long shadows across the prairie grass. Another said the silence after his engine died was more terrifying than the sight itself. The sudden loss of motion, the vulnerability of being stranded in the dark with something unknown hovering above. Sheriff Clem, who had initially dismissed the reports, never fully recanted, but admitted for the rest of his life that he had seen something unusual. His testimony added credibility to what might otherwise have been dismissed as panic. When combined with the consistency of more than a dozen calls received within a narrow time frame, the case stood apart from isolated sightings. Decades later, the Levelland case remains a touchstone in UFO research. Analysts point to the electromagnetic interference as key evidence. Many UFO reports involve strange lights, but few include such direct interaction with vehicles. The repeated stalling of engines across different cars and different witnesses suggests more than imagination or coincidence. Skeptics still argue for natural causes, but even they struggle to explain why so many separate incidents occurred in such a concentrated area on a single night. For the people who lived it, the Levelland UFO was not an abstraction. It was a night of fear, confusion, and awe, when the familiar roads they had driven countless times became the stage for something unearthly. Drivers who might otherwise never have spoken to one another shared a common story. An object descending from the sky, engines dying, and the night lit by an otherworldly glow. In the end, the official record closed with the label of ball lightning, but few who were there believed it. The object left no photographs, no radar logs, only the testimony of frightened motorists and the memory of dead engines on a dark Texas highway. But for many, that was more than enough. The Levelland case still lingers in the American imagination because it feels tangible. It was not just a light in the distance, but an event that reached down into people's lives, affecting their machines, halting them on the road, forcing them to look upward in fear. That combination of physical disruption and mass testimony makes it one of the most compelling UFO encounters ever recorded. And for those who remember the night of November 2nd, 1957, The prairie highways will never feel entirely ordinary again. For a few hours, something unknown claimed them, leaving behind only stalled engines, glowing skies, and the certainty that the world above the Texas plains held mysteries still unanswered. The Atlantic radar intrusion, September 1976, Morocco. The radar operator froze. A solid target had just appeared on his scope, fast, low, and unannounced. Confirm heading 270, speed 750, he muttered into his headset, expecting the contact to fade. But instead of vanishing, the blip grew stronger. Seconds later, 2 more appeared beside it. Within minutes, the quiet shift at Morocco's coastal radar station had turned into chaos. Urgent voices echoed across the comms. Multiple targets. No transponders. Bearing northeast. By 11:15 p.m., alarms rang at Kenitra Air Base. Mirage F-1 fighters roared off the runway, afterburners splitting the night, racing toward intruders that seemed to move with impossible speed. What began as routine monitoring of the Atlantic approaches was about to become one of Morocco's strangest Cold War encounters. The first return appeared just after 11 p.m. at a radar site south of Rabat. The signal was not weak or diffuse. It was crisp, strong, and structured, the kind controllers recognized instantly as solid aircraft. But its behavior defied logic. One moment it was moving at incredible speed. The next, it seemed to pause almost motionless, before darting forward again. Controllers checked their logs. No scheduled flights were listed in that sector. No transponder codes were showing. Within minutes, a second radar station confirmed the same object. Then, a third. Cross-confirmation removed any hope of dismissing it as a malfunction. Something was out there, and it was moving in ways no known jet could. As operators watched, the screen lit further. At least 4 unknowns were now present, sometimes flying in parallel courses, sometimes veering off at sharp right angles. Each echo was distinct, steady, and strong. The Atlantic corridor, usually quiet at that hour, had become a theater of anomalies. Inside the command center, the duty officer made the decision. Scramble order. At Kenitra Air Base, pilots sprinted to their Mirages. The F-1 was Morocco's pride, fast, agile, and NATO standard. If intruders were pushing into Moroccan airspace, it was the best tool they had. Within minutes, afterburners lit up the night sky. The Mirages climbed sharply, guided by ground control intercept officers who vectored them toward the targets. The pilots expected Soviet reconnaissance planes, or perhaps unregistered transports slipping through the Atlantic air corridor. But what they found was nothing they could have prepared for. As the fighters closed in, radar operators gave updated bearings. Pilots scanned the night sky. "I've got a visual," one called. Ahead, a brilliant light glowed at high altitude, steady and unwavering. He banked toward it, closing rapidly. Just as he prepared to intercept, the light shot across the sky with instant acceleration, vanishing from view in seconds. Yet his onboard radar still painted the target. Another pilot described approaching what looked like a stationary light. As he closed, the object split in two. One half shot upward into the upper atmosphere. The other dove low over the ocean before disappearing completely, both from sight and from radar. These were not evasive maneuvers of conventional aircraft. They were instantaneous, physics-defying bursts of movement. For nearly an hour, Moroccan fighters attempted intercept after intercept. Radar controllers directed them from one blip to another, but each time the intruders slipped away. Sometimes they appeared stationary, hanging like stars above the Atlantic. Other times, they streaked off at angles no jet could match. The pilots returned with fuel nearly gone, frustrated and shaken. They had engaged, pursued, and failed. Whatever they were chasing was not constrained by the rules of aerodynamics. At Kenitra, debriefings ran late into the night. Pilots described brilliant lights, instantaneous acceleration, and objects that split into multiple forms. Radar operators backed them with logs, showing strong returns tracked simultaneously by multiple stations. The Moroccan Air Force compiled a full report, radar tapes preserved, pilot statements recorded, civilian sightings noted. The language was careful but unmistakable. Anomalous aerial phenomena detected on radar and visually confirmed. Intercepts unsuccessful. Objects departed without explanation. Though primarily a military incident, civilians also witnessed strange lights. Fishermen off the Atlantic coast reported luminous objects darting across the horizon. In Casablanca, late-night drivers saw glowing shapes streaking silently above. Villagers along the coast whispered the next morning about white stars that moved too fast to be planes. Their timing and locations matched the radar tracks, adding weight to the military reports. Morocco's position in 1976 was strategically significant. U.S. forces still operated communications facilities in country, and NATO monitored the Atlantic corridor closely. When Moroccan officers compiled their reports, they did not stay within national channels for long. U.S. advisors at Kenitra and Nouassur were briefed. American radar personnel acknowledged they too had detected anomalies that night. Cables were quietly sent to liaison offices in Madrid and Paris. The case was taken seriously, not dismissed. In Cold War skies, unidentified returns were no small matter. But the behavior described, acceleration beyond known limits, vertical climbs into the atmosphere, splitting into multiple objects, made it impossible to classify. The immediate aftermath was quiet. No press releases, no official denials. Within Air Force circles, the story circulated as rumor, pilots whispering about lights that outflew their mirages. But officially, the incident was shelved. The file, marked unresolved, was forwarded discreetly to NATO contacts and archived. To the public, nothing was said. Years later, skeptics suggested radar error. Morocco's Atlantic coast is prone to temperature inversions, which can cause anomalous propagation. But multiple independent stations tracked the same solid returns simultaneously, ruling out localized interference. Others speculated about U.S. aircraft, perhaps clandestine reconnaissance flights. But no known platform in 1976 could split into two, accelerate into the upper atmosphere, or dive into the ocean at supersonic speed. The pilots themselves dismissed such theories. They knew radar ghosts. They knew the behavior of conventional jets. What they saw, what they chased, was neither. The Atlantic radar intrusion occurred in the same year as another dramatic case, the Tehran dogfight of September 1976, when Iranian F-4 jets attempted to intercept luminous objects over Tehran. Those objects, too, were confirmed on radar, visually observed by pilots, and outmaneuvered every attempt at pursuit. Across Europe, NATO radar networks occasionally flagged unexplained returns, often dismissed as clutter. But Morocco's case stood out. Not only radar data, but pilots scrambled into the air, civilians confirming from the ground, and international allies quietly informed. By the late 1970s, a clear pattern was emerging. Luminous, structured objects intruding into controlled airspace, tracked on radar, pursued by jets, and departing without explanation. For Moroccan pilots, the night was not folklore. It was an operational mission. Armed, fueled, and flown at speed, they returned empty-handed, humbled by adversaries that could not be caught. For radar operators, it was a night that exposed the limits of their equipment. Their screens told them something solid was there, yet each intercept ended in futility. For Moroccan authorities, it was a file they could not close with certainty. Their only option was silence. On a September night in 1976, Morocco's skies played host to intruders unlike any others. Radar screens lit up with impossible returns. Fighters roared into the dark. Pilots saw lights that split, climbed into the heavens, and dove into the Atlantic. Civilian eyes confirmed what military logs recorded. And then, nothing. The objects vanished as suddenly as they had come. The Atlantic radar intrusion stands today as one of the most compelling UFO cases of North Africa. A reminder that even in the most tightly monitored Cold War skies, there were phenomena that no pilot, no radar, no command could explain. They came, they revealed themselves briefly, and they left, leaving behind only the certainty that something extraordinary had crossed Moroccan airspace, beyond pursuit, beyond denial, and beyond understanding. Araraquara River Encounter, 1970s Colombia. The Colombian Amazon is one of the most isolated regions on Earth, a labyrinth of rivers cutting through dense jungle where villages are accessible only by boat or small aircraft. In the 1970s, the town of Araraquara, located on the Caqueta River, was little more than a missionary outpost, an airstrip, and a scattering of indigenous settlements. It was here, along a quiet bend in the river, that a group of witnesses reported a close encounter that would eventually involve the Colombian Air Force and the river police, and remain one of Colombia's most enduring UFO mysteries. The story begins on a humid evening in 1974. A missionary group stationed at Araraquara had finished their evening prayers when several of them stepped outside to enjoy the cool air. One of them, Father Julio Barragan, later said that the night seemed unusually still, the jungle insects quiet, the sky clear. It was then that they noticed a light approaching low along the river, brighter and steadier than any boat lantern. At first, the witnesses assumed it was a police patrol skiff, perhaps the fluvial police who monitored smuggling along the river. But the light rose above the tree line and hovered silently. It was not a boat. The object, glowing white with a faint bluish edge, settled no more than 100 meters away, above a sandbar midstream. The missionaries called others from inside. Together, they watched as the light resolved into a disc-shaped craft with a dome on top. It was perhaps 20 meters across, luminous yet solid. The object projected a wide beam of light downward onto the river, illuminating the water so brightly that fish could be seen darting beneath the surface. For nearly 5 minutes, the craft hovered there, silent and steady, its beam sweeping slowly across the current. Suddenly, the beam shifted toward the shore where the missionaries stood. Several of them felt an intense wave of heat and dropped to the ground. One woman later described the sensation as standing too close to a bonfire, but with no smoke, no flame. Radios in the outpost crackled and went dead. A small diesel generator powering the mission's lights sputtered and stopped. Then, just as suddenly, the beam retracted. The object tilted upward and shot into the sky with astonishing speed, vanishing into the night in seconds. Shaken, the missionaries documented the event in their daily log. Father Barragan insisted they had seen something structured, not a meteor or atmospheric illusion. The following morning, they contacted the fluvial police detachment stationed downstream. Officers arrived by boat, interviewed the witnesses, and examined the area. They found no debris, but noted that several patches of vegetation near the shore were scorched, their leaves browned and brittle. The police report was forwarded to the regional command in Florencia, which in turn alerted the Colombian Air Force, FAC. At the time, FAC had been quietly monitoring UFO reports across the country, including sightings near Bogotá and over military bases in Meta. A small team of Air Force officers flew to Araraquara in a twin-engine transport. They interviewed the missionaries, took soil and vegetation samples, and inspected the mission's generator, which still bore signs of unexplained electrical failure. Though their findings were never made public, locals recalled that the Air Force officers seemed perplexed. One reportedly admitted, "This is not a helicopter, not a plane." It left no trace of entry or exit. The officers returned to Bogotá with their notes, and the case faded into classified silence. Meanwhile, word spread among river communities. Fishermen claimed they too had seen strange lights over the Caquetá. One told missionaries he had watched an orb of light rise from the water itself, hovering briefly before vanishing into the forest. Another said his canoe had been rocked by waves when a glowing craft passed overhead. By late 1974, the Araraquara encounter had become the subject of regional rumor. Local newspapers in Caquetá printed small stories about luces misteriosas, citing unnamed police sources who confirmed unusual reports. The national press paid little attention, distracted by Colombia's political turbulence and guerrilla conflict. But in Araraquara, the event remained vivid. Skeptics suggested alternative explanations. Some said the missionaries had misidentified a military aircraft, though none were scheduled in the area that night. Others argued it was ball lightning, but the clear skies and prolonged hovering contradicted this. The electrical interference, scorched vegetation, and detailed testimony of multiple witnesses made such dismissals unsatisfying. For the missionaries, the experience was transformative. Several refused to walk alone at night near the river for months afterward. They wrote letters to their superiors describing the fear they felt, not only of the unknown craft, but of its silence, its precision, and its seeming awareness of their presence. In later years, UFO researchers revisited Araraquara. Interviews with surviving witnesses remained consistent. The missionaries still described the same disk, the same dome, the same sweeping beam. The fluvial police logs from 1974, though sparse, confirmed that an official report had been filed. Though the Air Force never released its conclusions, researchers considered the case one of Colombia's strongest CE2 encounters. What gives the Araraquara case particular weight is the convergence of institutions. Missionaries kept written logs, police officers filed official notes, Air Force officers investigated on site. These layers of documentation separate it from hearsay or folklore. While no photographs exist, the written record is clear. Something unexplained visited the Caquetá River that night. Today, Araraquara is better known for its dramatic canyon and biodiversity than for its UFO history. Yet among locals, the story endures. Elders along the river recall the night when light descended on the water, when radios failed, and when even the jungle seemed to hold its breath. For them, it was no legend but a lived reality, etched into memory as sharply as the currents of the river itself. The Araraquara River encounter remains unexplained. No military craft of the era could hover silently, project heat without flame, disable generators, and then accelerate skyward in seconds. For the missionaries, the police, and the Air Force officers who examined the site, it was undeniable. Something structured and deliberate appeared above the Caquetá that night. And so the case endures, part of Colombia's broader tapestry of UFO reports. Pilots chased by lights over Bogotá, strange objects tracked over Meta, and mysterious craft reported deep in the Amazon. But among them all, the Araraquara encounter stands apart, not only for its vivid witness accounts, but for the way it pulled in institutions, church, police, and military, all converging on a single truth they could not explain. The Zanfretta abductions, December 6, 1978, Torriglia, Italy. The Fiat's headlights pierced the dense fog curling through the Ligurian mountains, illuminating narrow ribbons of asphalt and frozen stone walls. Midnight was near in the village of Torriglia, and the road to the remote vacation estate known as Villa Casa Nostra was deserted. No other cars, no sounds, only the hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of tires over ice. Inside the tiny security patrol vehicle, Pier Fortunato Zanfretta gripped the wheel tighter than usual. He didn't know why, but something felt wrong. Minutes later, he parked and stepped out, boots sinking into damp soil, flashlights slicing through the darkness. The air was dense, almost charged. A strange pressure built in his ears, as if the atmosphere itself were reacting to something unseen. His breath fogged before him in short, uneasy bursts as he approached the villa grounds. Then, the silence shattered. A movement, quick, massive, stirred the hedgerows. Zanfretta stopped. His light caught something that shouldn't have been there. Towering figures, nearly 3 meters tall, standing motionless in the bushes. Their skin was scaled and greenish. Their eyes glowed yellow. They wore bulky metallic suits, hissing faintly. Zanfretta's mouth went dry. He reached for his pistol, but before he could draw, a searing white light enveloped him. He screamed. The radio in his car crackled to life. "Zanfretta, come in." No response, only static. And then, huge, terrible beings. They're here. The transmission cut out. When the Carabinieri found him an hour later, the patrol car's engine was still running. Zanfretta sat inside, shaking, unable to speak, his eyes wide with terror. Burn marks marred his uniform. His pistol was back in its holster, untouched, though he had no memory of ever retrieving it. The official report would list the time as 1:10 a.m. That moment marked the beginning of one of the most chilling and well-documented alien abduction cases in European history. In the hours that followed, Zanfretta attempted to recount what had happened. He spoke of being lifted into a craft by a column of blinding light, of being surrounded by enormous reptilian beings who communicated telepathically. They said they were from the third galaxy, a planet orbiting Tau Ceti. They had been watching, studying, waiting, and he had been chosen. The media storm began almost immediately. Italy's major newspapers ran headlines about the terrified security guard who claimed to have met extraterrestrials. Many scoffed, but the Carabinieri's report, publicly available, spoke of emotional shock, physical traces, and a serious, consistent account. It was enough to attract the attention of researchers, psychologists, and skeptics alike. In the weeks that followed, Zanfretta underwent a series of hypnosis sessions under the guidance of Dr. Mauro Moretti from the International Center of Medical Hypnosis in Milan. These sessions were recorded and analyzed. Under hypnosis, Zanfreda described multiple abductions, each time providing new and consistent details. He spoke of glowing panels, alien machinery, and a clear warning: humans were not ready for contact. The descriptions never wavered. The beings were huge, at least 9 feet tall, with bumpy skin, clawed hands, and glowing eyes. Their technology was beyond comprehension, and yet their tone was strangely clinical, even cold. In one session, Zanfreda broke down in tears, recalling how one creature had inserted a clear sphere into his skull. It was meant to monitor him, they said. His role was not just as a witness, but as an unwilling messenger. More unsettling still were the repeated disappearances. On several occasions in 1979 and 1980, Zanfreda vanished from his patrol route, only to be found hours later in distant locations, dazed, drenched in sweat, and suffering from amnesia. During one incident, other guards reported seeing a strange light shoot into the sky moments before Zanfreda's radio went silent. When he was found, he could barely speak. Investigators documented the cases thoroughly. Soil samples from the original site were compressed and slightly scorched. Semicircular indentations in the earth suggested the presence of an extremely heavy object. Witnesses from the village reported strange lights in the sky on the night of the first abduction. One local, a mechanic named Carlo Rossi, said his dog barked wildly and refused to go near the wooded area near the villa for days. Yet perhaps the most convincing evidence was Zanfreda himself. He never sought money, fame, or publicity. He turned down book offers. He refused most media appearances. When he finally did appear on Italian television in the mid-1880s, it was clear he was uncomfortable. His hands trembled, and his eyes darted nervously as he recounted his story once more. Despite this, his account remained unchanged. Journalist Rino Di Stefano, who investigated the case for over a decade, interviewed Zanfreda numerous times and reviewed official police files, hypnosis tapes, and corroborating witness statements. He became convinced that Zanfreda believed every word he said and had suffered tremendously because of it. Di Stefano published multiple articles and a book compiling the vast documentation behind the case. The public remained divided. Skeptics argued that Zanfreda might have suffered hallucinations or psychological trauma, though extensive mental health evaluations at the time found no signs of psychosis or delusion. Others believed that his story fit too closely with emerging accounts of alien abductions around the world to be coincidence. In the small town of Torriglia, where the hills are still quiet and the roads still twist through the mountains, memories of that strange winter night linger. A small plaque near the villa now marks the alleged landing site, placed there not as proof, but as recognition of one man's unwavering testimony. Zanfreda, now retired and living in obscurity, rarely speaks publicly anymore, but he never recanted. In a rare interview decades later, he said quietly, "I didn't want this. I still wish it had never happened, but I can't forget what I saw, and I never will." The case remains open, both literally and figuratively. No one has been able to disprove Zanfreda's account, and perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. If what he claimed was true, then we are not alone. And someone, or something, chose a solitary night watchman in a mountain village to remind us of that fact. The Longford Bridge sighting, September 1976. Longford Bridge, Coventry Canal, Warwickshire, England. Longford Bridge over the Coventry Canal in Warwickshire was an unremarkable crossing in the mid-1970s, lined with hedgerows, dim street lamps, and the hum of late-night traffic on the nearby A444. nothing hinted it would become the subject of a quietly documented Cold War-era UFO encounter. It was a September evening in 1976 when Michael Hughes, a 27-year-old delivery driver from Bedworth, was heading home after finishing his last drop in Nuneaton. The roads were clear, the air cool, and the smell of damp earth lingered after a brief shower earlier that evening. As he approached the turnoff toward Longford Bridge, he noticed an unusual glow ahead. Not the sharp glare of headlights, but something softer, suspended above the canal. At first, Hughes assumed it was the reflection of a floodlight from a nearby industrial yard. But as he drew closer, the light seemed self-contained, without any visible source on the ground. Slowing his van, he pulled to the side just before the bridge and stepped out. The light hung roughly 30 feet above the water, steady and bright white, with a faint bluish edge. Its shape was difficult to judge at first, until it tilted slightly, revealing a disc-like form no larger than a small car. Beneath it, a diffuse column of light stretched down toward the water's surface, rippling faintly like heat haze. Hughes later recalled that the canal water directly under the column shimmered unnaturally, despite the stillness of the night. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then, without warning, the object slid silently across the canal, passing directly above his position. He felt a tingling pressure in the air, not painful, but enough to make the hair on his arms stand up. While Hughes stood rooted to the spot, another car approached from the opposite direction. The driver, a middle-aged woman named Jean Turner, slowed almost to a stop when she saw the light. They exchanged a brief glance, but neither spoke. Both were fixed on the object. The disc moved toward the eastern bank, halting briefly above a stand of willow trees before rising vertically. Hughes estimated it climbed to about 200 feet before it accelerated away at an angle, disappearing toward the south in less than 5 seconds. Shaken, Hughes got back into his van and drove straight home, but sleep was elusive. The next morning, he decided to phone the local police station, not to file a formal report, but to ask if anyone else had seen strange lights the previous night. To his surprise, the desk sergeant didn't dismiss the question. Instead, he told Hughes that a patrol car in nearby Exhall had also reported an unusual aerial light around the same time, one that had moved too fast and too erratically to be an aircraft. That call led to an interview later the same day with a uniformed officer who took Hughes's account in detail. The officer mentioned that the Ministry of Defense sometimes reviewed such reports, though they rarely provided feedback. It was only weeks later, through a friend who worked at the Coventry Telegraph, that Hughes learned someone else had witnessed the object. Jean Turner, the woman in the other car. She had given a near-identical description to the paper, describing it as hanging in the air without sound or movement, showing no sign that it cared they were looking, and then vanishing in an instant. The report was never printed. Instead, it was quietly forwarded to RAF Cosford, which handled certain aerial incident inquiries for the region. From that point, the trail seemed to vanish. Hughes carried on with his work, occasionally recounting the sighting to friends, but never pursuing it further. Turner, by all accounts, was less inclined to discuss it publicly. Behind the scenes, however, the Longford Bridge case was quietly noted in a series of internal MOD memos, portions of which surfaced decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests. The released pages, heavily redacted, confirm that an unidentified aerial phenomenon was reported by 2 independent civilian witnesses on the night in question. The document also references possible correlation with 2 additional visual reports from the West Midlands that same evening, though details are sparse. One paragraph stands out. No radar confirmation from RAF Neatishead or RAF Bulmer. Phenomenon observed at close range, exhibiting stable hover and vertical ascent without detectable acoustic signature. No meteorological explanation applicable. Filed as unexplained. The mid-1970s were an active period for British UFO reports, though most never reached public awareness. The Ministry of Defense maintained what it called the Defense Intelligence Staff UFO Desk, a small office tasked with collecting and cataloging reports passed from police, RAF stations, and occasionally the public. While many were quickly dismissed as aircraft, meteors, or atmospheric phenomena, cases involving multiple witnesses, structured craft, or unusual maneuvers were logged in greater detail. RAF Cosford, the station to which the Longford Bridge case was forwarded, was not only a training base, but also acted as a regional hub for aerial incident evaluation. If a sighting was considered credible but lacked immediate explanation, Cosford's protocol was to assess for defense significance, essentially whether the object might represent a foreign aircraft or technology. If no threat was identified, the case was generally filed without follow-up. The lack of radar confirmation from major stations like Neatishead and Bulmer meant the MOD would classify the sighting as no defense significance, not implying it didn't happen, but simply that it posed no identifiable military risk. This classification often led to the closure of cases even when the visual reports were strong. What makes the Longford Bridge sighting particularly intriguing is its proximity to Coventry's industrial perimeter, where several defense contractors operated during the 1970s. The location also sat along a low-altitude approach path occasionally used by military helicopters, making it notable that both witnesses insisted the object produced no sound, not even the faint thump of rotor blades. The following day, according to another redacted memo, 2 plainclothes personnel visited the site. Hughes, passing the bridge on his way to work, noticed them standing by the canal with measuring equipment. One appeared to be taking readings near the waterline, while the other sketched the bridge's structure. They did not approach him, and he didn't stop. Locals later recalled that for several nights afterward, a small patrol boat operated in that stretch of the canal, though no one could say whether it was related. Such discreet site visits were not unusual. The MOD occasionally dispatched small field teams to check for physical traces, soil disturbance, magnetic interference, or radiation anomalies. In the 1970s, these teams sometimes used portable Geiger counters, compasses to test for magnetic deviation, and Polaroid cameras to document the site. If any such data was gathered at Longford Bridge, it never appeared in the declassified file. By the time the Ministry of Defense files were opened to the public in the early 2000s under the UK's Freedom of Information Act, the Longford Bridge incident had largely faded from public memory. Buried among more sensational cases, it attracted little attention outside local circles. Yet for those familiar with British close encounters of the 1970s, its combination of low-altitude observation, multiple witnesses, and apparent MOD interest makes it stand out. The file's final page, dated late October 1976, contains a brief closing note stating that no further investigation was warranted, that witness credibility was assessed as high, and that the object's behavior remained without satisfactory explanation. Today, the bridge remains much as it was, a modest crossing over still water, with traffic passing steadily in both directions. There is no plaque, no local legend, no lingering public story. But for two drivers on a quiet September night in 1976, it became the setting for an encounter quietly filed away under unexplained. The official paperwork may have reduced it to a paragraph and a statistical entry, but for Hughes and Turner, the sighting was a direct and undeniable moment. A bright, silent object, hovering where nothing should be, moving in ways no aircraft they knew could move. Decades later, the government's file still said more in what it left unsaid than in what it revealed, leaving the incident as one more unresolved fragment in Britain's understated UFO history. The Vilvoorde sighting. June 18, 1990. Vilvoorde, Belgium. It was just past 2 a.m. when officers Roland and Mark of the Vilvoorde Municipal Police pulled their patrol car over on the shoulder of a narrow rural road. The call had come in from a local farmer, a report of strange lights hovering in the fields outside of town. These were the kinds of calls most officers rolled their eyes at. Belgium had seen a wave of such sightings since 1989, and they had become common enough that most units didn't respond unless there was a safety risk. But this caller had insisted the lights were low, steady, and unnatural, and the farmer sounded shaken. So the two men drove out to investigate. Their vehicle's headlights stretched forward in a wide arc, catching nothing but dewy grass and thick hedgerows. For a few minutes, there was silence. Then Roland pointed. Hovering about 150 meters from the road, seemingly just above the field, was a black triangular craft. No noise, no exhaust, no strobe or blinking lights. Just 3 steady red-orange lights, one at each corner of the triangle, and a single, larger, white light in the center. The entire object moved slowly, silently, perhaps no more than 10 meters above the ground. Mark turned off the car engine. The air was still. There were no animals stirring, no rustling from the trees. They stepped out of the car. Both officers would later testify that what they witnessed next defied their understanding of any known aircraft. The object began to rotate slowly, the lights maintaining their geometric formation. Then, without warning, it began moving toward the west, still low and silent, accelerating gradually but purposefully. Roland grabbed the police radio and called in the sighting. The dispatcher at Vilvoorde Central hesitated, then instructed them to maintain visual contact and report any changes. The officers pursued in their vehicle, trying to match its direction along a parallel road, but the object moved faster. The officers saw it lift higher, angling upward, still maintaining its triangular orientation. Then it simply shot into the sky. No sound, no sonic boom, just a blur of acceleration until the lights were gone. The two men sat in their car, stunned. They looked at each other. Neither said anything for a while. Back at headquarters, the written report was filed with full professionalism. Both officers described the shape, size, behavior, and flight characteristics of the object. Notably, both included almost identical descriptions, using terms like triangular, silent, and hovering. Neither officer attempted to theorize what it was. They simply reported what they saw. Their supervisor forwarded the report to the Belgian gendarmerie, who had been collecting data on similar sightings as part of a national inquiry known unofficially as the Belgian UFO wave. The gendarmerie, in turn, passed the report to the Belgian Air Force. Over the next few days, investigators checked local radar logs. That night, radar installations in the area had picked up an anomalous object matching the officer's reported time and location, traveling at low altitude, then vanishing from radar within seconds. No flight plans had been filed, and no known aircraft were operating in that corridor at the time. The incident gained added weight because it was corroborated by trained law enforcement officials, professionals expected to observe and report with precision. The Belgian UFO wave, which had started in late 1989, had produced hundreds of such reports, but few had come from police officers during active patrol duty. This one did. The sighting matched the characteristics of dozens of others reported throughout Belgium between 1989 and 1991. The triangular shape, silent operation, and hovering behavior were consistent. In some earlier cases, radar visual contacts were also recorded, leading to dramatic nights where Belgian F-16s were scrambled to intercept these unidentified targets, only for the jets to be outmaneuvered or lose lock-on as the objects climbed or dropped at impossible speeds. One such event had occurred in March of that year, when the Belgian Air Force tracked multiple unknowns on radar and even captured parts of the chase on infrared imaging. But despite the military's involvement and a detailed public press conference, including radar prints and pilot statements, no definitive identification of the objects was ever made. In the Vilvoorde case, investigators from SOBEPS, Belgian Society for the Study of Space Phenomena, interviewed both officers independently. Their testimonies remained consistent. No hypnosis was used, no suggestions made. The organization noted that these officers had no known history of hoaxing, attention-seeking, or belief in UFO phenomena. They were considered level-headed, professional, and trustworthy. Photos and video had been taken by other civilians during the UFO wave in different parts of Belgium, including images that appeared to show large, dark triangles with lights at their tips. However, no photo or video from the Vilvoorde event was ever released, only the written reports and personal testimonies of the two officers. Later, skeptics suggested the sightings across Belgium could have been misidentified aircraft, especially stealth planes being tested by NATO or the U.S. military. But Belgian Air Force officials publicly denied any such operations during the relevant time periods. They stated no foreign aircraft had been granted permission to fly in Belgian airspace without notification, especially not black, triangle-shaped craft hovering over towns. The most puzzling aspect of the Vilvoorde case, and others like it, was the lack of any sonic footprint. No noise, no downdraft. Just slow, deliberate movement, followed by sudden vertical acceleration. The speed and silence defied known propulsion systems. A declassified internal summary by the Belgian military concluded the objects seen during the UFO wave could not be explained by known conventional technology, but also admitted they had no evidence of threat or hostility. As for the two officers from Vilvoorde, they kept their distance from the media. They never gave public interviews. They never capitalized on the sighting. They returned to their normal patrols and eventually retired with honors from the force. Years later, when privately contacted by researchers, they remained consistent. They had seen what they had seen. The government inquiry quietly concluded by the mid-1990s, and no definitive answers emerged. The wave of sightings tapered off, but the files remained. Belgium's handling of the wave was notably transparent. Military and civilian authorities held joint press conferences, shared radar data, and cooperated openly with investigators. Even so, the mystery of the black triangles persists. Why did these craft choose to appear so frequently over Belgian skies, and why during such a narrow window of time? Were they experimental aircraft being quietly tested by a foreign power? Or were they something else, operating by rules and technologies beyond human understanding? For now, the files remain open, and the Vilvoorde sighting remains one of the most well-documented, sober, and compelling events of the Belgian UFO wave. The Night Siege of Ilkley Moor, December 1st, 1987. Ilkley Moor, Yorkshire, UK. It was bitterly cold when Philip Spencer set out just after 7 a.m. The fog clung low to the moors, the frost etched into every blade of grass, and silence hung thick over the Yorkshire hills. A former police officer turned security guard, Spencer had taken the morning off to visit his father-in-law. He brought with him a camera, hoping to capture the haunting winter scenery of Ilkley Moor. But what he ended up capturing, at least according to him, was something else entirely. Something unexplainable. Spencer had moved with his family to Yorkshire earlier that year. A quiet man, known for his seriousness and rational thinking, he was not the sort one would associate with wild tales. He had a solid reputation, and those who knew him described him as reliable and calm, not prone to fantasy. That morning, as he trudged along the path into the moorland, he carried a compass and a camera in his coat pocket. The light was poor, and visibility was limited to a few hundred feet at most. His journey was supposed to be simple: cut across the moor and take the train to his father-in-law's house. But within half an hour, Spencer claimed, everything changed. He crested a small ridge and noticed something strange just down the path. A figure, about 4 feet tall, hunched, with a large head and elongated limbs. At first, he thought it might be a child, but then it turned toward him. Its skin, he said, was pale greenish-gray, and its face was unmistakably not human. Large black eyes, small mouth, no visible nose. The creature moved quickly, and instinctively Spencer raised his camera and took a photo. The figure turned and darted up a hillside, disappearing over the ridge. Stunned, Spencer sprinted in the same direction, reaching the top only seconds later. But the figure was gone. What he did see, though, froze him in place. In the valley below was a large, metallic craft, hovering, silent, with a faint blue glow beneath it. Spencer said it lifted slowly, tilted to one side, and vanished into the fog. No sound, no rush of wind. Just gone. Disoriented, he reached for his compass and noticed something was wrong. The needle spun erratically, unable to find north. His watch had stopped. He didn't know how much time had passed, but it felt as though only minutes had gone by. Still shaken, he hurried across the moor and caught a later train than he'd planned. When he arrived at his father-in-law's home, he checked the time. It was nearly 2 hours later than it should have been, and he couldn't account for it. 2 hours. Missing. Over the following days, Spencer couldn't shake the experience. He developed the film and found, to his disbelief, that the photograph had captured something. It was grainy and out of focus, but there, unmistakably, was a figure. Humanoid. Short, with a bulbous head and strange proportions. It stood mid-stride on a gravel path. Skeptics argued the figure was just a person in a suit or even a hoax. But the photograph was sent to multiple photographic analysis labs, including one at Kodak. Experts could not determine what the figure was, but they did confirm the image was genuine and had not been tampered with. The negatives were clean. There were no signs of double exposure or manipulation. The British UFO Research Association, BUFORA, took interest. They arranged for Spencer to undergo hypnotic regression, curious to know if he could recall more of the missing time. The results were unsettling. Under hypnosis, Spencer recalled that after he took the photo and crested the hill, He had been surrounded by a bright light and lifted into the air. He described being paralyzed, then finding himself inside a sterile metallic room. There, he said, the beings examined him, his blood taken, his eyes inspected, his limbs tested. He recalled seeing images projected onto the walls, visions of war, environmental destruction, and then peaceful landscapes. He was told, telepathically, that he would forget until the time was right. Then, he was left back on the moor, disoriented, as if waking from a dream. Many dismissed the hypnosis results as influenced by suggestion or imagination, but others noted the consistency with reports from other alleged abductees worldwide. Spencer never sought fame, never tried to profit from the encounter. He refused media interviews and requested anonymity for years. His identity only became public later, long after the original event. The photo he took remains one of the most controversial and enduring pieces of alleged UFO evidence in the UK. It has been scrutinized, enhanced, and debated for decades. Some insist it shows nothing but a trick of light, a misinterpreted bush, or even a prankster in a costume. But no one has ever definitively debunked it. The location, Ilkley Moor, has its own legends. Locals have long spoken of strange lights in the sky, livestock disappearing, and eerie sounds at night. In 1987, weeks before Spencer's sighting, several residents reported seeing odd lights above the moor, including one witness who claimed a glowing sphere hovered silently above her house. None of that made national news. It stayed within the community, mostly dismissed. Until Spencer came forward. What makes the Ilkley Moor case compelling to researchers isn't just the photo or the regression. It's the man himself. He was not interested in UFOs. He didn't follow the phenomenon. He worked in law enforcement, a grounded and skeptical profession. Those who interviewed him noted his consistent account, his discomfort with attention, and his unwillingness to embellish. He never changed his story. Years later, Spencer would move away and refuse to talk about the event in detail. He felt it had defined his life in ways he hadn't asked for. "I saw something," he told a journalist once. "I know what I saw, and it wasn't a man in a suit. It wasn't a helicopter or a plane. I wish I hadn't seen it." Today, the moors remain unchanged, windswept, fog-covered, timeless. Hikers still walk the same paths, and once in a while, someone stops, looks up, sees something they can't explain. Ilkley Moor doesn't offer answers, but it still holds the memory of a cold December morning when one man went looking for scenery and found something else entirely. Something that, for over 3 decades, no one has been able to explain away. The Tanna Island Orbs, 2003 to 2013, Mount Yasur, Tanna Island, Vanuatu. It begins like a myth, but it's all too real. On a humid summer evening in 2007, a Danish backpacker named Lars Jensen stood on the rim of Mount Yasur, the active volcano that dominates the southeastern flank of Tanna Island. He was alone except for his handheld camcorder and a local guide, Jonah, a soft-spoken man from the nearby village of Sulphur Bay. The volcano rumbled gently beneath their feet, the night air thick with the tang of sulfur and salt. Lars had been filming the frequent eruptions, pillars of lava exploding into the air, when suddenly, without warning, a silent sphere of bluish-white light drifted slowly upward from within the crater. It hovered mid-air for a moment, then zipped out of frame in a motion too fast for the naked eye. He glanced at Jonah, startled. "Spirit," Jonah said, as if that explained everything. Lars would later upload the clip to an obscure travel blog. It gathered dust in digital obscurity until it was rediscovered 5 years later, around the time more researchers began converging on Tana Island, not for tourism, but for answers. Mount Yasur has been erupting nearly continuously for hundreds of years, earning it the nickname the Lighthouse of the Pacific. But beginning in the early 2000s, an unusual pattern of phenomena began to catch attention. Luminous spheres, described by witnesses as glowing orbs, would appear above or even inside the crater. Some entered the mouth of the volcano, lingered, and then exited unscathed, unaffected by the molten chaos within. At first, these were chalked up to atmospheric oddities or camera glare, but over the years, tourists from France, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan reported sightings. Locals had long accepted them as part of the natural order, manifestations of the ancestral sky spirits they had always worshipped. One account in 2003 came from a French honeymooning couple, Marie and Philippe Dupont, who were watching a nighttime eruption when two luminous spheres emerged from the cloud of ash and hung in the sky silently, like a pair of eyes observing the island. They hovered for nearly a minute before rising straight up and vanishing behind a curtain of stars. Their camera caught only a faint trace of light, but their memory of it remained vivid. It felt alive, Marie recalled years later in a travel documentary. Amateur geologists like Dr. Greg Hammond took notice. By 2009, he'd made multiple trips to Tana to document geological data, but became increasingly fascinated by the orbs. There's no logical explanation for a sphere of light entering an erupting volcano and not disintegrating, he said in one interview. If this is a naturally occurring plasma or ball lightning, it's like nothing we've seen. But locals didn't require scientific verification. In Sulphur Bay and surrounding villages, the orbs were part of daily life. Children were warned not to follow them into the jungle. Elders told stories of Alel, beings of light who came and went through the heart of Mount Yasur. One chief claimed the orbs had protected their ancestors from colonial invaders. Others said the lights had been appearing since the beginning. Some villagers claimed that the orbs only emerged during specific phases of the moon, or when visitors from certain lands were present. A few whispered that foreign soldiers during World War II had seen them too, but that those stories were covered up. Strangely, some of the most credible sightings came from guides, men and women who escorted tourists to the crater nightly and had seen the orbs dozens of times, yet still gasped with awe each appearance. In 2011, a team of German researchers brought advanced video equipment, sensors, and thermal imaging tools to study the area. Over 3 weeks, they recorded several eruptions, but failed to capture an orb. On their final night, a guide named Kalepi insisted they stay 1 more hour. That night, 2 spheres of pale green light appeared inside the crater. The footage, now archived by an academic journal in Berlin, shows the lights hovering just above the magma for nearly 45 seconds before fading without a trace. The thermal readings, strangely, recorded no abnormal heat signature from the orbs themselves. This pattern, of brilliant light with no accompanying heat, left scientists puzzled. Plasma typically generates immense heat. Yet whatever these were, they seemed immune to the rules of combustion. In 2012, a Japanese film crew from NHK arrived to create a documentary on volcano tourism. While interviewing villagers, they accidentally recorded one of the most compelling pieces of evidence to date. A ball of light, roughly the size of a basketball, floated silently past the edge of the crater in broad daylight. The video shows birds scattering, a dog barking, and then total stillness. The orb paused briefly over the crater mouth, shuddered once, and then zipped vertically into the clouds. While skeptics continued to suggest ball lightning, camera artifacts, or misidentified drones, these theories lost weight with each new sighting. No drone can survive 1,000-degree gases within an active volcano. No atmospheric phenomenon lingers with apparent sentience, responding to people or environment. The locals were indifferent to outside speculation. For them, the orbs were alive. They were watchers, perhaps messengers. Some elders believed the orbs came from inside the earth, not space. One storyteller likened the volcano to a womb of the world and the orbs as its breath. Anthropologists began to take greater interest. The oral traditions surrounding the orbs extended back generations, before electricity, before airplanes. What had these people been witnessing all this time? Had the lights been constant companions to this fiery mountain, ignored only because no one bothered to look deeper? Despite efforts to study them, the orbs remained elusive. They appeared unannounced, often when no cameras were rolling. And yet, they never ceased entirely. On average, one credible sighting occurred every 4 to 6 months between 2003 and 2013. Perhaps most intriguingly, some villagers began reporting dreams before the sightings, visions of light, strange music, or ancestors whispering from the jungle. One respected midwife claimed the orbs visited her during childbirth ceremonies to witness new life. Though such claims could not be verified, the frequency of similar dreams among unrelated villagers prompted quiet attention from cultural researchers. By 2013, the sightings tapered. Some blamed climate changes. Others believed the volcano had simply gone quiet spiritually. But even after the documented events slowed, the belief remained. One last sighting, reported in October 2013, came from a Dutch volcanologist named Peter van der Meij. He was recording gas emissions near the southern slope when an orange sphere zipped down the mountainside, passed directly over his equipment, and vanished into the jungle canopy. His instruments picked up a magnetic pulse, but no other data. He published a brief note in a scientific bulletin, ending with, "We are dealing with something unique, either a natural phenomenon never before categorized, or something far stranger." Mount Yasur still erupts today, unchanged and unbothered. Tourists still visit. Local guides still watch the sky. And though no definitive answer has been reached, the sightings remain burned into the collective memory of all who encountered them. Maybe they are earth-born anomalies. Maybe they are sentient observers. Or perhaps, like the volcano itself, they have always been with us, older than science, older than story, watching from the breath of the earth. The Imjärvi skiers incident. January 7, 1970, Lake Imjärvi, near Heinola, Finland. The winter afternoon over Lake Imjärvi was dim and cold. The snow on the open fields was undisturbed except for 2 narrow ski tracks leading from the forest toward the frozen lake. Cross-country skiing was routine for Esko Viljo, a 36-year-old caretaker, and his younger friend Arto Heino, a 24-year-old mechanic. They knew these tracks well. The open stretch by the lakeside and the winding path that skirted the forest edge. The air was sharp enough to redden the skin, and every push forward made the sound of skis over packed snow ring out against the stillness. They had made the trip many times before. Nothing in the air or on the ground suggested that today would be any different. They were moving side by side along a stretch near the lake's edge when something caught Viljo's attention. Ahead and slightly to the right, a bright point of light appeared against the overcast sky. At first, he assumed it might be a reflection or a trick of the low winter sun breaking through the clouds. But the light did not fade. It grew. The point swelled into a sphere, its brilliance cutting sharply through the gray atmosphere. Heino noticed it at the same moment and slowed, watching as it descended toward them. There was no noise, no whine of an engine, no chop of rotor blades, no rushing wind. The light seemed self-contained, a perfectly steady glow without flicker or haze. Within seconds, the form of an object began to emerge from the glare. Both men could now see that it was metallic, disc-shaped, and no larger than a small car. It hung in the air at treetop height, utterly still. Its surface reflected the muted winter light in a dull, silvery sheen. Before either could speak, a shaft of white light beamed down from its underside. The beam struck Viljo squarely, illuminating him in the snow. He froze, not out of choice, but because his body no longer obeyed him. He later described the sensation as if his muscles had been switched off. He felt a sudden, enveloping heat, not like the warmth of a fire, but an intense, penetrating wave that seemed to come from inside as much as from without. His vision swam, and a metallic taste filled his mouth. Heino stood only a few paces away, untouched by the beam, but close enough to see the expression on Viljo's face. A mix of shock, strain, and confusion. He shouted to him, but Viljo did not answer. The encounter lasted only seconds, perhaps no more than a minute, but the two men would later agree that time felt stretched. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the beam withdrew. The disc lifted slightly, tilted on one edge, and shot upward into the low cloud cover, vanishing from sight. The only sound was a faint rush of displaced air that faded into the silence. Viljo's knees gave way, and he collapsed onto the snow. Heino dropped beside him, helping him to sit upright. Viljo's breathing was rapid, and his skin was flushed. He complained of weakness, dizziness, and an odd burning sensation in his face and hands. There was also the smell, sharp, chemical, and unpleasant, hanging in the cold air around them. Heino would later liken it to a mixture of sulfur and ozone. The two men decided to head back toward town. Viljo's skiing was labored, his movements stiff, so they moved slowly. By the time they reached home, dusk had given way to the deep winter dark. That evening, Viljo's condition worsened. His face became puffy, his eyes bloodshot, and his skin reddened in patches as if mildly burned. He also developed a persistent headache and complained of an unquenchable thirst. Heino, though shaken, felt only mild irritation in his eyes, which subsided after a few hours. Concerned, they reported the incident to the local police. The next day, officers visited the area where the encounter had occurred. The snow was undisturbed apart from the men's ski tracks, but in the exact spot where Viljo had been standing, they found a shallow depression and an area of loose, disturbed snow in a neat circular pattern. There were no animal tracks, no signs of machinery, and no branches or debris fallen from the trees. The case caught the attention of Finnish Defense Forces personnel, who made discreet inquiries. No aircraft had been reported in the area that day. The weather was stable, overcast skies, light wind, and no electrical storms that might account for unusual atmospheric phenomena. Viljo was examined by doctors in Heinola and later in Helsinki. The medical notes, which would later circulate among Finnish UFO researchers, described symptoms consistent with exposure to intense heat or radiation: skin erythema, mild swelling, elevated blood pressure, and general fatigue. No burns or blisters were found, but the reddening of his skin persisted for days. Blood tests revealed no abnormalities severe enough to require hospitalization, and within 2 weeks, most of the symptoms had subsided, though Viljo reported lingering fatigue. For Heino, the experience was primarily one of psychological shock. In interviews with police and later with investigators from the Finnish UFO Research Association, he described the craft in the same terms as Viljo: a smooth, metallic disc, no visible seams or markings, with a bright, concentrated light beam from its underside. His testimony matched Viljo's in all essential details. Civilian investigators arrived within days. The Finnish UFO Research Association, then only a few years old, treated the case as one of the most compelling close encounters they had yet recorded. They documented the site thoroughly, photographed the circular disturbance in the snow, and took statements from both men separately to compare for consistency. The statements matched closely, even in small details, such as the angle of the craft when it departed, and the unusual smell left in the air. Over the following weeks, speculation grew among researchers and locals. Some suggested the men had encountered an experimental Soviet drone or reconnaissance craft, given Finland's proximity to the USSR and the Cold War tensions of the period. Others believed the incident fit into a small but growing category of UFO encounters where witnesses experienced physical effects after exposure to a beam or light from an unknown object. Indeed, the Imjärvi case bore similarities to reports from other countries in the late 1960s and early 1970s, where beams from hovering craft had caused temporary paralysis, localized heating, and other physiological reactions. Unlike many of those reports, however, the Imjärvi witnesses were healthy, experienced outdoorsmen, and the incident occurred in daylight on open ground, making misidentification of common aerial objects less likely. By mid-1970, the incident had been discussed in UFO periodicals across Europe. The Finnish Defense Forces maintained no official statement beyond confirming that no known aircraft were in the area at the time. The police file remained open for a short period before being quietly closed without explanation. Viljo returned to work after several weeks, but avoided skiing on that part of the lake for months afterward. Heino continued the hobby, but admitted that he now watched the sky more than he once did. Both men stuck to their original account for the rest of their lives, never embellishing it beyond what they had reported in those first days. For Finnish UFO researchers, the case remains one of the best documented CE2 incidents in the country's history. The combination of two credible witnesses, immediate physical effects, a clear environmental location, and consistent testimonies makes it stand apart from most reports. In later years, Viljo reflected that the most unsettling part was not the beam itself, but the fact that it had singled him out, affecting him while leaving Heino untouched. Neither man could suggest why that might be. The question lingered. Was the beam a deliberate act of observation, a scanning process, or something else entirely? Lake Imjärvi today remains as quiet as it was that winter day. Cross-country skiers still trace the frozen edges. The snow still lies deep in January, and the pale sun still struggles to break through the cloud. There is no trace on the ground of what happened in 1970, but the accounts of Viljo and Heino have endured in Finnish archives and international UFO literature. The case invites no easy answers, only the image of a silent disk, a shaft of light, and a frozen moment in which an ordinary winter outing turned into one of the most puzzling encounters in Finland's modern history. The Exeter UFO Case. September 3rd, 1965, Exeter, New Hampshire, USA. The dog was barking again. Officer Eugene Bertrand Jr. flicked off his high beams and scanned the roadside near Route 101 just outside Exeter. It was a little after midnight on September 3rd, 1965, and the New Hampshire countryside was still and dark, broken only by the occasional rustle of trees or distant chirp of insects. But the barking had drawn his attention. It wasn't normal, not at this hour, and not with such urgency. He slowed his patrol car and pulled over. Standing in a gravel pullout, lit only by moonlight and the dim wash of his cruiser's headlights, was a young woman sitting in her car. She looked shaken. "What's going on, ma'am?" he asked as he approached her window. The woman, in her early 20s, said she'd pulled over to calm her dog. Moments earlier, she explained, a large, silent object had descended from the sky. It hovered just above her vehicle. Bright red lights blinked in a circular motion underneath. The dog had gone wild. She'd been too frightened to get out of the car and too afraid to drive away. Bertrand scanned the sky. Nothing. But the woman's fear seemed real. She wasn't hysterical. She was clear, composed, and adamant that she had just encountered something in the air. Something big. Something she couldn't explain. Bertrand took her statement and let her go. He figured maybe it was a low-flying plane, a trick of the light, maybe nerves. But something didn't sit right with him. Less than an hour later, another report came in. This time from a teenager, 18-year-old Norman Muscarello. He had been hitchhiking home from a girlfriend's house in nearby Amesbury. While walking along Route 150 near Kensington, he saw something in the field beside him. At first, he thought it was a house on fire. A brilliant red light pulsated in the darkness, flaring and dimming in a strange pattern. Then, the shape emerged. A massive, silent object rose from behind the trees and hovered over the field. It had 5 powerful red lights, all pulsing in sequence. It was low. So low he could see the underside, which he described as metallic and structured. Muscarello dropped to the ground in fear. When he looked up again, the object was still there, watching, motionless. Then it moved, drifting silently across the road. Muscarello bolted toward the nearest house, pounding on the door. No one answered. He kept running until he reached a farmhouse and called the police. At the Exeter station, Officer Bertrand was surprised to see the teenager arrive in a state of shock, nearly breathless, telling a story that echoed the one he'd heard earlier. Bertrand had seen UFO stories in the papers, but this wasn't a prank call. Muscarello was visibly disturbed, and his account came with precise details. The lights, the hovering, the silence. Bertrand decided to investigate personally. He put Muscarello in the cruiser and headed back to the scene, where Officer David Hunt joined them. What happened next would change everything. As they walked into the field, flashlights sweeping the darkness, the witnesses suddenly froze. Rising over the treetops, just as Muscarello had described, was a large object with 5 bright red lights. They were flashing in sequence, left to right, as if rotating in a circular motion. The lights cast eerie shadows across the field and lit up the trees in an unnatural glow. Then it moved. The craft began to drift toward them. Slowly, silently, It hovered, passed overhead, and kept going until it disappeared behind the tree line. Muscarello shouted. Bertrand and Hunt stood speechless. This was no prank. They had all seen it. Bertrand, still processing what they'd witnessed, made a formal report as soon as they returned to the station. He was careful in his wording. He did not speculate. He simply described what he had seen. A large, silent object with 5 red lights that hovered and moved without any visible means of propulsion. It didn't match any known aircraft. It didn't emit sound. It didn't behave like anything he'd seen in his years of service. Word spread quickly. Within hours, the incident reached Pease Air Force Base. The base sent investigators to interview the witnesses. In their initial report, military officials suggested the sightings were caused by a formation of B-47 bombers flying in standard pattern. But Bertrand, Hunt, and Muscarello rejected that explanation outright. Bertrand, a trained observer and veteran, said it couldn't have been planes. There was no sound, no vibration. And planes don't hover silently and flash red lights in a rotating pattern. He went on record with his disagreement. So did Hunt. So did Muscarello. The Air Force's explanation changed again, this time to temperature inversion, causing stars or planets to appear as moving lights. That only frustrated the witnesses more. These weren't stars. This wasn't a misidentified celestial object. It was a craft, a solid one, with structured form and deliberate movement. The sighting attracted the attention of civilian UFO researchers, including the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP. They launched their own inquiry and found additional witnesses who had seen similar objects in the area that night and in the days leading up to the event. Residents around Exeter reported glowing lights in the sky, objects hovering low over power lines, and silent disks that moved unlike any known aircraft. Some even filed reports of close encounters, lights peering into windows, animals reacting with panic, and vehicles stalling. The Air Force maintained its stance, misidentification, but the case refused to fade. What made the Exeter incident different from others was the credibility of the witnesses. 2 trained police officers and a civilian teenager, all giving independent but consistent accounts. No exaggeration, no fame-seeking, just an encounter, unexplained and unforgettable. In 1966, the case was referenced in congressional hearings on UFOs. It became one of the centerpieces of civilian pressure on the government to take sightings more seriously. The Condon Committee, a scientific panel assigned by the U.S. Air Force to study UFO reports, even mentioned it briefly in its final report, though without a conclusive finding. Years later, in interviews, Bertrand and Hunt stuck to their story. Neither man ever changed a word of his testimony. Neither offered alternative theories or excuses. Bertrand once said, "I'll never forget what I saw, and I know what I saw was real." The field where the sighting took place is still there, just off Route 150, surrounded by woods. Locals know the story. Some say they've seen things too, even in recent years. Lights where there shouldn't be lights. Sounds where there shouldn't be sounds. The Exeter incident remains to this day one of the most compelling UFO encounters in American history, not because of aliens or abduction or science fiction tropes, but because of its simplicity, its clarity, and the people involved. 3 men saw something they couldn't explain. They were brave enough to report it. And despite efforts to rewrite, downplay, or dismiss it, their story has never changed. They never claimed to know what it was, only that it was there. The Tiny Craft of Kira, September 1972. Kira, Kochi Prefecture, Japan. "Look, over there," one of the boys shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of excitement and fear. The others turned, their sandals skidding along the paddy ridge. What they expected to see was a frog or a scrap of tin. Instead, they froze. Sitting in the grass was a small metallic object. No larger than a soup bowl, it had a dome-shaped top that glimmered faintly in the afternoon sun, and a darker underside. For a long, breathless moment it remained still, almost inviting them closer. One boy stepped forward. The others followed. Then the object stirred. It tilted, spun on its axis, and lifted silently into the air. The children gasped as it hovered just above their heads, gliding in an arc as though watching them. Then, with sudden speed, it shot across the paddy and vanished. The boys stumbled after it, but it was gone. All that remained was a neat circle of flattened grass. Later, one told a local reporter, "It was small, but it moved like it knew where to go. When we tried to catch it, it ran away from us." That first glimpse lasted less than a minute, but it was only the beginning. A few days later, walking home from school, the boys saw the craft again in the same field. They tried to surround it, spreading in a circle. As they closed in, it spun and rose straight up, hovered briefly, then darted east. One boy remembered, "When we got close, it would lift. When we stopped, it stopped. It was like it was teasing us." Over the next 2 weeks, they claimed at least half a dozen encounters. Each time, the object appeared low to the ground, then reacted when they tried to capture it. Once they flung a cloth over it. The fabric rose into the air, bulging as though something pushed upward, before the object wriggled free and shot skyward. In another attempt, a boy trapped it in his school satchel. The group stared at the bag in disbelief. Then it jerked upward in his hands, slipped out, and darted away. "It was light," he said later, "but when we tried to hold it, it moved by itself, like it wanted to escape." Some sightings took place in daylight, others at dusk, when the boys said it gave off a faint glow while spinning. It became the center of their afternoons. School ended, and they rushed to the fields, convinced the craft was waiting for them. At first, no one believed them. Parents scolded the boys for telling stories. "Too many TV shows," one father said. But the children kept describing the same details. Their teacher noticed their restlessness and asked them to explain in class. Each gave the same description: a silver dome, silent, no larger than a bowl, moving with deliberate precision. Later, she recalled, they told the story in the same way, with the same details. They were not making it up in front of me. Other villagers began to take notice. A farmer claimed to see a small, flickering light darting above the paddies. Some neighbors teased the children, others admitted unease. One villager remarked, "If it was only once, maybe they imagined it." But they kept seeing it, always in the same place. That is harder to ignore. Families grew divided. Some wanted the boys to stay quiet, fearing ridicule. Others cautiously believed them. One mother told a reporter, "He has never lied to me before." But what else could it be except a child's story? Police were eventually called. Officers questioned the boys, searched the paddies, and examined flattened patches of grass. They found nothing but noted how consistent the children were, even when interviewed separately. One policeman admitted, "The children are sincere." but there is no physical proof. We can only say they are not lying. His notebook recorded only. Children report small flying object. No evidence found. Story consistent. Their involvement gave the case weight. The boys were no longer just telling stories to friends. They were giving testimony. The Kochi Nichi Shimbun ran an article under the headline, "School Children Report Strange Flying Object." It described a saucer-like object, no bigger than a hat, and quoted the boys. It spun quickly and gave off a strange light when it rose. Other papers in Shikoku picked up the story. Reporters interviewed villagers and even staked out the fields at night. One journalist claimed to glimpse a faint silver flicker, but admitted it was too brief to confirm. By the mid-1970s, UFO researchers in Japan were including the Kira case in their newsletters. English-language UFO journals mentioned it as one of the strangest incidents on record. A group of children repeatedly encountering a miniature disc that seemed to respond to them. Whether the Japan Self-Defense Forces were formally informed is unclear. Some researchers believe the reports must have reached military channels, especially during a period of heightened Cold War vigilance. But if any inquiry was made, it was never made public. By autumn's end, police had closed their file, reporters had moved on, and officials had fallen silent. The encounters left their mark on the boys. At school, they sketched domes in their notebooks. Some classmates mocked them, while others pressed them to retell the story. At home, arguments continued. Parents wanted the subject dropped, but the boys insisted they had seen and touched something real. Years later, one remembered, "Our parents told us to forget it." But how could we forget something like that? We touched it. We knew it was real. For villagers, the memory lingered. Farmers joked about the toy saucer, yet admitted unease when pressed. Teachers recalled how steady the boys had been in their testimony. But by winter, other stories filled the papers, and the Kira craft faded from public view, preserved only in the files of UFO researchers. Japan's folklore gave the case deeper resonance. Rural communities had long spoken of hitodama, ghostly lights said to float across fields, and fishermen told of sea lanterns rising from the water. To some, the boys' story echoed those legends, yet their descriptions were strikingly mechanical, metallic, spinning, deliberate. It was folklore transformed into machinery. The 1970s were also a decade of growing UFO fascination in Japan. Translated books and magazines popularized saucer accounts, while small UFO associations collected reports. Still, in Kochi Prefecture, daily life revolved around farming more than science fiction. The villagers saw the event through 3 lenses at once: children describing what they saw, parents recalling old ghost stories, and reporters framing it as a miniature saucer. Skeptics had their explanations. Some claimed the boys had mistaken a toy or balloon. Others accused them of hoaxing. But their accounts remained stubbornly consistent. They described a metallic disc that hovered, darted, and even resisted capture. Balloons did not lift satchels into the air or free themselves from cloth traps. Tin toys did not glow or maneuver with precision. Remote-controlled models existed in 1972, but they were rare, costly, and incapable of the movements described. Weather balloons were sometimes launched, but they drifted with the wind and looked nothing like what the boys sketched. Without evidence, skeptics fell back on dismissal, calling it fantasy or exaggeration. Yet, even decades later, when some of the boys were interviewed as adults, their testimony had not changed. They still described the same craft, elusive and unexplainable. Time moved on. The paddies were harvested, The children grew up, and the story faded from headlines. But for the boys, the memory endured. One of them said later, "It was small, like a toy, but it wasn't a toy. It was alive in a way. It moved as if it knew us." Their persistence is what makes the Kira incident remarkable. Children often forget, exaggerate, or contradict themselves. But here, across decades, their stories never wavered. For researchers, the case remains a quiet puzzle. It was not a mass sighting with radar confirmation, but something subtler, a small craft, tangible enough to be touched, yet impossible to capture. Authorities logged it and forgot it. Newspapers gave it a few columns. But the boys carried it as lived experience. What was the tiny craft of Kira? A prank, an unknown toy, or something else entirely? No conclusion was ever reached, no evidence ever produced. All that remains is the testimony of children who saw and briefly held a mystery that resisted explanation. Sometimes the unknown does not arrive as blazing lights in the sky. Sometimes it comes small, playful, and silent, hovering just above rice fields before slipping back into the dark. The Clan Lake Incident, June 18, 1960, Clan Lake, Northwest Territories, Canada. The northern wilderness of Canada has always carried its own silence, the kind that soaks into the trees, into the lake water, into the mind of anyone who stays too long without company. On a calm afternoon in June 1960, that silence was broken by something that would never be explained. Not by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, not by Ottawa, and not by the two prospectors who witnessed it. Clan Lake lies about 30 kilometers north of Yellowknife. Remote, even by northern standards, the lake is a stretch of deep blue cradled in boreal forest and ancient stone. In the summer of 1960, it was a popular spot for mineral exploration. Among the many temporary camps set up along the lake's shore was one operated by two independent prospectors, Gerald Hawthorne and Robert Spracklin. On the afternoon of June 18th, the men were wrapping up their day's work. According to later statements given to the RCMP, it was approximately 3:15 p.m. when they heard a sound that startled both of them. Spracklin described it as a thud, like a large log hitting the surface of the lake. They turned toward the water. At first, they saw only ripples. Then, about 200 yards from shore, a circular object emerged, not from beneath, but from above. It appeared to descend straight down into the lake, making minimal splash despite its size. They estimated the object to be about 5 feet in diameter, metallic, with a smooth, dull silver surface. It had no markings, no wings, no visible propulsion. Hawthorne would later tell investigators, "It just came down like it had no weight, like it was being lowered by something invisible." After it entered the water, the lake settled quickly. Within a minute, there were no further disturbances. Both men were sober, experienced outdoorsmen. They had encountered bears, bad weather, and broken equipment, but never anything that behaved like what they had seen. That evening, they recorded the incident in their camp log. The next morning, they made their way back to Yellowknife by float plane and filed a report with the local RCMP detachment. Constable Brian Wilkie interviewed the men separately. He found their accounts consistent and noted that neither appeared agitated or prone to exaggeration. In his report, later released through an Access to Information request in the 1990s, Wilkie wrote, "Both men describe sighting an unknown aerial object descending into Clan Lake. No conventional aircraft matching the description was reported in the area. The RCMP forwarded the case to the Department of National Defense, DND, in Ottawa. What happened next was never formally disclosed to the public. 3 days after the report was filed, 2 officers from the Canadian Forces Base Cold Lake arrived in Yellowknife. According to a Yellowknife Airport staff log from June 21st, a military hydrographic team requested charter transport to Clan Lake. The name of the requester was not made public, but the flight was logged. Hawthorne and Spracklin, meanwhile, returned to their camp to continue their work. They were not informed of any official investigation. However, they were not alone for long. On June 22nd, a float plane circled Clan Lake and landed at the opposite end of the shoreline. A group of 4 men disembarked, wearing plain clothing but carrying crates marked with stenciled numbers. One of them approached the prospectors' camp and asked a series of quiet questions. How long they had been there, whether they had noticed any unusual debris, and if their campsite included diving equipment. Spracklin noted that one of the men referred to subsurface scans, a term he hadn't heard before. They stayed no longer than 2 hours. No one ever said what they were looking for. On June 24th, the group departed. The prospectors remained for another 2 weeks, eventually abandoning their stake due to equipment failure. Years later, in 1981, the incident resurfaced when Canadian UFO researcher Chris Rutkowski obtained partial RCMP and DND files referring to the event. Though heavily redacted, one note referred to the object as an aerial anomaly with subaqueous termination. Another file, dated July 7, 1960, included a field assessment from a DND officer stating, "No trace of aircraft wreckage found. No civilian or military flight plans match the description. No further action required." In the absence of debris or radar data, the case went cold. But what stood out was the level of quiet coordination. Military presence was not officially announced, yet records show flights were booked, lake scans performed, and inquiries made. Rutkowski later commented, "What we have here is a textbook case of early Cold War protocol, a real incident, officially investigated, then buried." To the public, nothing happened at Clan Lake. The local papers never ran the story. The RCMP archived the report. The Department of National Defense filed the incident under non-hostile unknowns, but among researchers, Clan Lake remains one of the most credible submerged object sightings in Canada. Its lack of sensationalism is part of what makes it compelling. The men who witnessed it had no reason to lie. They didn't seek media attention. They weren't scared, just confused. Spracklin passed away in 1989. Hawthorne, interviewed shortly before his death in 1995, remained consistent. It was real. We saw it. But what it was, I couldn't tell you. One of the more intriguing details came decades later from a retired Department of Transport employee who claimed to have reviewed internal memos about the case. In a 2002 letter to the Canadian UFO Survey, he wrote, "There was concern it might be a foreign surveillance platform, but the descent profile didn't match balloon or drone dynamics. The term controlled drop was used in one internal note." No such technology was known to exist in 1960. Unlike cases involving flashing lights or abduction claims, the Clan Lake event sits in a quieter category: unprovoked, unpublicized, and unresolved. It fits into a larger tapestry of Canadian sightings that were quietly documented, sometimes investigated, and often shelved. There is no monument at Clan Lake, no local legends. only a faint ripple in the historical record and the memory of two men who stood by their story. In 2016, a private expedition led by civilian researchers attempted to revisit the site using side-scan sonar. Though weather conditions limited the scope of their search, no anomalous debris was recovered. They reported unusual sonar reflections in a section of the lake bed, but lacked the resources to dive or sample the area. To this day, the official line remains unchanged. No confirmed object, no further inquiry. But among researchers, the Clan Lake incident holds a quiet weight. It is a reminder that not all sightings come with flashing lights or military chases. Some arrive without sound, leave without warning, and fall into places where no one looks. And when two men who knew the land, knew the lake, and knew their own senses say that something unnatural came down that day, it becomes difficult to dismiss. Not every mystery announces itself. Some just drift down from the sky and vanish into a cold northern lake, as if to say, "You weren't meant to find me," only to notice.
If you found this video helpful or interesting, go ahead and click the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you'll always stay updated with our latest content. We truly appreciate your support.